So I really hope this is working now. It looks like we're going live. The first stream in a while, and this is really last minute for me. I know people haven't seen me in a while, so probably people think I've been twiddling my thumbs, but this has been quite a hectic weekend. I'm broadcasting this for the first time from my Linux laptop, so if anyone has any audio problems, if anyone can't hear what I'm saying, blame the penguin, because I had no end of trouble setting this thing up. Apparently half the functions that work on Windows don't even work on the Linux version of OBS, so hopefully people are seeing me. Again, I'm going to be looking to the chat to make sure that I'm actually even, people are even hearing me right now. Okay, great. Someone's telling me that I'm fine in sound and picture. Apparently one of my microphones doesn't work on Linux. And of course, you're debugging this thing at the last minute, and it's of course how to get a microphone to work is always open up a terminal and start typing in apt-get X and apt-get Y and make sure you have the following package. But no, I've been trying to make more of an effort to switch to more open systems. So I figured it was time to actually start streaming on Linux properly. So again, forgive me for the late start for a few minutes. I think I streamed on election night, but since then, oh my God, it's almost been an entire month since I uploaded anything or live streamed on this channel. What's so funny is it's not due to any kind of lack of putting effort into video editing. For the last 20 days or so, I've been working a lot. Well, first on work and family, which consumes the majority of my time. But the other thing is I've been working on editing my father's autobiography. We interviewed him for about 3 hours on his early life during World War II. And I was able to turn it into kind of a movie. And maybe at some point I'll put some of it on the channel if he's the one who gets to call the shots. But I really, really wanted to do a good job because his experiences being German in Eastern Europe are just so unique. And just before I came on to live stream this, I just got back from giving them a kind of a rough cut preview. It was more or less done, but I hadn't tested the sounds on the TV screen, and of course the treble and bass were all out of whack, so that was an issue. But it seemed like my parents liked it, and my dad was eager to see all these old photos. Of course, I'm going through all these old, family photos and cutting them out and trying to paste them into a slideshow over the interview I did with my father. And it tells a really great story, but there's just not enough photos from that era. My family were refugees during World War II, and so the amount of family memorabilia they have is just minimal. And so, of course, I'm just scrounging around the internet for photos of sort of the Danube-Swabian story. Basically, they're a German population that lived along the Danube in at least the eastern part of the Danube, basically from the 18th century, the early 18th century to the mid 20th century before they were ethnically cleansed. And it's just, it's amazing how hard it is to find certain stories about World War II that kind of go against the narrative, even if they don't contradict the sacred cows of the cathedral. You'll still have a hard time finding pictures of German refugees in Austria. I think there are about 10 of them, and I think I found all 10 of them that are, floating around Google, not behind paywalls. And you have to imagine that Vienna in 1946 was just overflowing with German refugees from Eastern Europe. I mean, the Austrian government was having a hard time dealing with the number of German refugees inside its own borders. And yet, if you do the Google searches for these images in order to pad out your documentary's visuals, you end up getting a bunch of stuff. You get up like Jewish refugees in Vienna. And I remember thinking to myself, Jewish refugees in Vienna in 1945? What Jewish family was fleeing into Germany in 1945? It doesn't sound right. So I'm rambling. But long story short, I plan kind of to have a talk written. But given the hectic nature of this weekend and everything I had to do with family and cooking and and so on and so forth. I ended up having very little time to prepare anything that was in terms of a PowerPoint. So I decided to just turn this into Ask Me Anything. So this Ask Me Anything, yeah, I know the format is a little bit weird. I usually have like a picture, but of course, the picture functionality in Linux OBS doesn't work very well because you can't crop it with the Alt command. So it's very hard to put a picture up. Also, since you can't crop or you can't import browsers without plugins that you have to install via the command line, I have to literally do a screen capture of the chat in order for anyone to see what they're writing to me. So between the lack of an image and the chat taking up half the screen, this is certainly not a typical dist-ans format, so forgive me. I will, however, take this time to earnestly answer all of your questions. I'm sure thoughts about the election will come up. I'm sure people asking me about things like, the Great Reset will come up. Maybe people asking me about COVID-19. That might come up too. There were two videos that I was going to see if I could make, and I'll still try to make them. The first one I've talked about for a while has been like my advice to people in their 20s, and the next one is one that I wanted to make about what have we learned from the COVID-19 crisis. And I think in some sense the things that we've learned from the COVID-19 crisis are very similar to the things that I think we're learning now again in, I don't know, what should we call it? The election crisis? And that's a more or less good enough name, I suppose. Yeah, but both of these things kind of fell by the wayside since I had so little time that wasn't just, going into the larger editing project that was more family focused. So again, my apologies. And I want to really take this time for the remainder of tonight to really put an honest effort into getting back into the live streaming spirit, getting back into answering questions. I kind of, since I don't have PowerPoint presentations and I don't have an outline that I'm working off of, all my answers to questions are going to be a little bit roughshod. And so I think maybe just having it be a standard Ask Me Anything. But remember, if there's any technical difficulties, if there's any problems with the audio or the video going out, this is not me being a boomer. This is the penguin. This is the penguin down there. He's the one who's doing it. He's the one that wants me to open up a terminal window and install plugins via apt-get and pip to make functionality that should work out of the box work. So, I kind of made Tux look evil because he was the only graphic I could have up here. But, I still really love Linux. I mean, anyone who, I don't know. I guess there's two people in the world. There are people who think running Linux is kind of a neat idea because they like the idea that they own their information. And for myself, this was me in high school. Now, oh God, I'm really dating myself now, but I was in high school in the early, you probably don't believe this. I was in high school in the early 2000s, which feels like another world, right? But if you were, Linux was not new. It was something that was gaining popularity in the mid to late 90s, but it certainly was not very well developed. And there was almost no support to it at all. And so I was running Red Hat or Mandrake or something like that, and nothing worked. It took me a weekend to get my CD-ROM to work. It took me another weekend to get my sound card to work. Getting on the internet you had to learn this Linux utility to get on the internet, ifconfig, I think it was called. Yeah, you had to learn ifconfig to get on the internet in the original version because the operating system wasn't well supported enough to actually communicate with your network card and just hook yourself up to the Ethernet cable line that you had running right into the computer. So it was an adventure. And of course, somewhere in the middle of college, I decided that I wanted to actually have a life outside of my computer. So I went back to Windows and I went back to Linux every now and again, but now I think I might be back for good because I thought until tonight that the penguin would not betray me. But tonight he betrayed me. I don't want to discover 5 minutes before the live stream that my microphone isn't supported by the operating system without taking a series of packages through the terminal. So we're gonna ignore that, Tux, and maybe just get on to answering super chats. So yeah, let's. I have Entropy and the Entropy link going on. So if you want to text me there, yeah. Again, it's been a while. But again, if I don't do at least one live stream a month, something will have to be seriously going wrong. So, yeah, let's do that. I think Entropy goes from the bottom, right? So this is the typical rules I use since I'm doing an Ask Me Anything. You can type in the chat a question with an @Distributist thing, and I might see it and respond to it. But the only things I'm definitely going to read are the super chats because they're the only things that I'm obliged to read. And I'll try to give nice, long answers, right? You're paying money. I should give you as long an answers as I possibly can. But, if there's an interesting question from the chat, I'll answer it. For instance, a question from the chat I'm seeing right now, use Arch Linux. I'm using Linux Mint, or is it Mint OS? I forget. It's working great. It's a great distribution for a laptop. I've used Kali Linux, and my server runs Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is terrible. And the only reason why I used Ubuntu was the first of the Linux distributions in the mid-2000s to get its, well, pardon my French, to get its shit together. It was the first plug-and-play Linux distribution in the late 2000s. And because of that, it was sort of my go-to one when I knew I needed Linux for something. I wanted to create, a home web server. I just installed Ubuntu without thinking about it. But little did I know that being first is not best. And since then, Ubuntu is a flaming piece of garbage. Almost everyone has the sort of apt-get functionality that we all know and love from the Debian distributions of Linux in the early 2000s. And in the meantime, I guess the people who make Ubuntu have turned it into a living piece of spyware. So, but again, I spent so much time configuring that server over the course of the last year and 2 years now. I don't really want to. I don't want to go back. Sorry. I want to go back. I want to install a better distribution, but I don't want to take the time to reconfigure everything. That just seems like a complete headache. And my scripting ability, I have some scripts that auto configure things in Linux, but it's not where it needs to be. If you're a guru, you're just a shell master, right? You can program all these shell scripts that transfer over all your configuration files because you know exactly where they are. That's not me. I can do some shell programming for backup, but that's pretty much the extent of it. Okay, so let's start with the super chats. So Narco Republican for $5. Hey Dave, I just found out about a certain Giambattista Vico. It's definitely worth a look. Well, again, I can't click on the YouTube link from the chat, but it sounds certainly very interesting, and thanks for the super chat to give me that. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to comment on something that I haven't seen yet, but it sounds really interesting. Oh, before we get started, let's just clear the air. The last stream I did was about the election. The last stream I did, was on the night of the election. It was about the election, sort of, as well. But in that stream, when we ended the stream, it looked like Trump was winning. And then, of course, since this was November 3rd, fast forward 3 hours, and all of a sudden, all these votes appear for Biden. And since then, the political sphere on YouTube has been totally inundated with election chatter and chatter about the stolen election. And this has kind of given me a long time to think about this. And this is coming from someone who is very cynical about elections generally. I'm answering this now because I know people will want to kind of repost off my reaction to this topic specifically. A lot of reactionary sympathetic people, and I'm thinking here of people like Academic Agent and Charlemagne, they really took this election hard. They saw the shenanigans, the obvious electoral shenanigans that were going on in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan, and they took it personally, and they went on a crusade for Trump. I'm not necessarily against that. I think that's perfectly fine. To be quite honest, I've seen what I would consider evidence for electoral shenanigans that satisfy they basically satisfy my reasonable balance of evidence that something really, really weird was going on in this election. And that's what we have evidence of right now, is that things that are statistically weird were going on in this election that weren't going on in most other elections. And on top of that, we have sort of anecdotal evidence or lived experiences or sworn affidavits, all kind of the same thing, basically meaning individual people saying they saw X or Y. And they tell us that something fishy was indeed going on in this election, and that they witnessed certain votes being faked, or votes essentially showing up at polling stations with no chain of custody, and all that sort of stuff. And you know, that's interesting, I guess. The two problems with this thing is I'm not so sure what this actually gets us. I might kind of be dropping the bomb here. Sure, this election was stolen. This election was dishonestly conducted. Are any elections ever honestly conducted in this country? That's sort of the reaction I came away with. I came away with the reaction was not that this was sort of a uniquely stolen election, but my reaction from what I heard in these polling stations was, so really there never are very good safeguards around cheating. But basically you could kind of cheat in any election if you really wanted to, within reason. I mean, of course, you couldn't say, for instance, that New York went Republican, and you couldn't say that Provo, Utah went Democrat, right? That's obviously smells foul. But if a few extra boxes of ballots were to show up in a Chicago precinct every now and again, no one would really try too hard to figure out what was going on, especially if this was an election where there wasn't a strong oppositional party that was trying to push back on what was going on. And that's sort of compounded with the fact that these elections themselves are so statistically sensitive that any tweak of the rules would immediately sway the election one way or the other. If you required voter identification at polling stations, now I haven't studied this, maybe this is incorrect, but my sense is that that requirement alone, a universal requirement for voter identification, very well might swing the popular vote in favor of the Republicans for the last two elections. That's my hunch. And even if it's not that much, it's certainly enough to sway the election over to Donald Trump. Because the ballots that are essentially giving Biden the election don't really have a very clear chain of custody. But do votes need that? Is that, I mean, my question is, are elections in this country ever fair? And if they're not fair in the technical sense, what does winning an election by a close margin even mean? If you win an election 51 to 49 or 52 to 48%, I wouldn't be surprised if there were, statistical errors or fraudulent ballots or double votes or lost votes that comprised almost about 1% of the actual electoral count. So I'm just wondering, I guess this kind of gets back to my whole question about democracy, and I guess I've signed up to a debate about democracy. They did the announcement about the date before I even confirmed that I could do it, but that's a modern day debate. But this is sort of the question, and maybe this is just way too academic. But what is an election like that even measuring? All it's measuring is the will of the bureaucracy in terms of how the votes are counted. Whether the election whether the method is honestly applied and there are mistakes, whether the method is honestly applied and there are ways that implicitly favor one party over the other, or whether the method is explicitly dishonestly applied, or what I think is the most likely thing that happened this election, that it was that the intentional mistakes were made. They kind of had, the people in charge of running the elections saw the tight margins in their state, and then they decided to turn a blind eye to the ordinary errors that would go on in any election. And so there was kind of willful blindness to obvious miscounting is how, and I think that's really, when the Democrats say, oh, we didn't cheat, what they mean is we didn't cheat or miscount any more than we do on any ordinary election. We just did so a little bit more strategically than we usually do. I don't know. I don't want to drop the bomb, but this election is... it's not really convincing me that this election is illegitimate, but it's doing more to convince me that elections like this are just stupid. and I don't see the point anymore. I don't see the point in I don't see why an election gives you legitimacy. It's basically the bureaucracy being asked to validate itself, and and I can get irritated at the brashness of the Democrats. I can get irritated. I can get sort of disgusted with their hypocrisy and sort of their moral or their immoral temerity. But I can't be surprised. I was expecting something like this. And because I can't be surprised, I'm finding it very difficult to be emotionally outraged. And I have to say this is one of the biggest problems I had reacting to this election. I think if you were to compare my views with this about this election with someone like Charlemagne's views, and I think Charlemagne in the last 2 or 3 weeks has shown himself to be very passionate on this issue, we would probably agree with the facts. But I just can't get behind the emotion. I'm pretty much assuming, one way or the other, that the bureaucracy is just going to kind of fake it and sweep the fakeness under the rug. And so, okay. So I guess, and then comes the second question. So let's say that and of course we don't have proof. We should say that we have evidence of shenanigans, probably worse shenanigans that go on in any ordinary year. Although I'm not completely convinced on that, but evidence of shenanigans nonetheless, right? And I think that's a legitimate enough reason to proceed with a legal challenge to this election. Fine, fair enough. And as we see, Trump and Giuliani and all those people they're mounting a legal challenge in the courts. And of course, some court somewhere, probably the Supreme Court, is going to decide who won this election, right? And of course, the Democrats know what side's up. They're not talking about they're not trying to refute the idea that fraud occurred on this election. No, they're not trying to do that, and they're smart not to do that. What the Democrats are trying to do is not build a case that the election was legitimate. What they're trying to do is get as many establishment organizations to recognize Biden as president before this case comes to court. Now, of course, everyone knows, who's watched my channel for a long time, that I, for my sins, for about 5 years, I was really into the shitty TV show Game of Thrones, right? And there's this scene where the king dies. This is in the early seasons when the show still had an idea of how to tell a story. The king dies and there is a battle over succession, right? And this is relevant because one of the main characters, the good guy, has discovered that the prospective heir to the throne is a bastard. He's essentially being put forward as the son of the king when there's no way the king could have fathered him. So essentially, he's not a legitimate heir to the throne. And when the king dies, or when the king is on his death, but I don't know if he's dead yet, the people who oppose the ascendancy of this prince come to the main character and go, we got to get as many people on our side denouncing this person as a bastard. Whether the king is alive or dead, we have to get we have to get the guy out of the Capitol as soon as possible, right? We have to spirit him away so that we can assure everyone that we're in power. Because, that's otherwise everyone gets the sense that this is the king, and they've accepted it in their mind. And so there's a psychological resistance to declare that person not being king. And of course, the main character doesn't do this. What he does is the worst possible thing. He storms into the throne room while lords are literally swearing fealty to the new bastard king. And he makes his case right there that the guy is a bastard, which of course is horrible, because there's already been so many established people who've sworn allegiance to this new leader, and they don't want to look like fools, because if they go back on that, they undermine their own power, right? So the Democrats know that what's most important right now is not the technical case over how many ballots were faked or not, right? Or even if there was a concerted effort to steal the election or whatnot, all that stuff. The most important thing is to make sure that the big power stakeholders in this country all recognize that Biden is president and go on record saying that Biden is president before this gets to trial. Because the Supreme Court and all the lower courts, they have the same friends, they go to the same cocktail parties, their children go to school in the same elite circles. If they declare Trump president after all these powerful people declare the exact opposite, they will be completely undermining the power of the elites in this country. And I really don't think, even with a more or less conservative Supreme Court, that a lot of conservative justices, and I mean conservative mostly in temperament, I don't think that they're going to want to take a bite out of that. They're going to understand that playing ball with that is going to be essentially seeding chaos and essentially tearing down the entire apparatus of order and control inside the United States and perhaps even the West. So that's why I don't want to pretend. I think Charlemagne knows that this is the case. I think Academic Agent knows this is the case. What I think that they're most interested in is to make the steal cost the establishment as much as humanly possible. Now of course and that's fine. I think that's good. That's laudable. I want the steal to cost the establishment as much as humanly possible. But I don't think that's going to stop the results, especially if more and more people start declaring Biden president-elect. By the time this comes to court in about a month, there are going to be so many powerful people who have essentially come out and declared the new leader of the free world to be Biden, that a reversal of that would be very, very detrimental to not just the government of the United States, but the entire elite aristocracy, or the entirety of what we in the reactionary sphere call the cathedral, which is really just the mainstream informational processing apparatus of our society. And again, I applaud Charlemagne for going to rallies and all this stuff, and that's very, very nice. But I guess at the end of the day, I question what's ultimately going to come of this. I question. I think it will make the cathedral hurt. Certainly, it certainly won't make Trump president. The only way Trump maintains the presidency at this stage is if he goes full Julius Caesar and just starts tearing out the apparatuses of the government, both legitimate and illegitimate, and just declares himself president in some official capacity. And that's something that is entirely in Trump's court. That's not, nobody can make that decision other than Trump. And I don't see any benefit in loudly hoping for that or loudly hoping against that eventuality from happening. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But one thing I want to be very, very clear, one thing I think the election everyone should be disabused of by this election, is that there's not something at stake here called democracy. I don't think that democracy exists in the kind of way that that we were raised to imagine it. Democracy, what? Democracy if 51% of the population plus some fraud overruling and essentially ruling over and suppressing the other 49% of this nation's population with as little compromise as possible granted. I don't know what that means. It's a proceduralism. I agree that it has a procedural form of democracy, but I don't know why I need to respect that. And increasingly, I think the question that people in my position need to ask is, what even are we fighting over? You're fighting, even the people who want to put Biden in power, they don't like Biden. They don't think he's going to do a good job. They just don't want to deal with Trump. So, I don't know. That's the election out of the way. And right when I said that, I realized that my computer has come unplugged. So I'm going to take a brief break here, just to mute myself and kill the video, and I'll be back when I actually manage to make sure the plug stays in. So hang tight, guys. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. I was muted. Apologize for that. But this laptop is not battery efficient. And the last thing I wanted was to have the live stream suddenly blank out because I didn't insert the power cord the right way and the baby safety. Now that every electrical outlet in this house has essentially been baby proofed, plugging things in correctly just is not as easy. I presume people are now hearing me. So you can correct yourself and okay, so wait, you guys gotta tell me that I'm actually broadcasting here. This thing is saying that the audio is coming through. Okay, well, let's hope it is. I don't know. Well, adventures in live streaming. Can't be that this thing. The last thing I want to see is somehow when I plug this in, Linux decided to. Okay, great, excellent. That's the worst thing is when you hear people saying no audio and you realize that you didn't turn the microphone back on fully because you didn't press down hard enough, and you don't know whether to proceed or not. But that being said about the were we focused? That being said about the election, I guess the question only I have is I'm not emotionally. I feel what I feel. And I agree factually with people like Charlemagne and Academic Agent, but I'm to be honest with you guys, I'm just not emotionally responding because, I think that this type of fraud probably is present in most American elections. They can't fake anything that's big. They can't fake a big margin swing, but they can push it 1 or 2 percentages up and down with fraud. And the second thing is I'm just not so sure really what I'm believing in when I believe in democracy. So I mean, true to me not believing in democracy, I just can't get. I mean, I'm sorry, but I can't emotionally get outraged by this. My only question is what to do. Well, okay. I mean, you could be an activist for Trump. You could get out there in the rallies, and I think Charlemagne. I've been kind of a little bit more offline this month than usual, but I saw Charlemagne was at a Trump protest, which I thought was really cool. Obviously, I'm not in D.C., so I'm not nowhere near D.C., so that's ever going to happen for myself. So you can go to protests and demonstrate that you support President Trump's bid to get this electoral fraud issue addressed. But we all know that that's not what's going to decide this, right? It's going to be the courts. So I guess, if you can use your body and your voice to make things more uncomfortable for the mainstream while they steal this election, that's fine. But again, it's not going to stop them from taking the election. It's not going to stop Biden from becoming president. And I'm actually more curious about what the landscape is going to look like after the quote unquote democratic fix comes in. And that's really where my thoughts have been. The issue of the election, and I understand the activism. I don't know what it's trying to accomplish though. And maybe this is something that Charlemagne, next time we speak, he could kind of fill me in on this. Beyond just being a thorn in our enemy's sides, which I'm all for, I don't think it really does anything material. It certainly doesn't. I mean, this is the thing I really want to disabuse people. It doesn't create the circumstances under which some kind of Julius Caesar moment could emerge. That will emerge from the person of the Caesar in question, not anything we do as a peanut gallery. As a matter of fact, if you're listening to the peanut gallery, probably no one who's listening to a peanut gallery will ever be that kind of Caesarian figure that I think some people in our circles are hoping for. But okay, that necessary caveat out of the way. Let's just proceed with questions. Oh, and I saw someone ask me in the chat, "Are you using Linux?" Yes, I'm streaming off of Linux. That is at least in part responsible for some of my tech issues. It forced me to use another microphone that I don't usually use, and apparently Linux OBS doesn't have a lot of the plugins that I've come to rely on. So anyway, so the next super chat is Blue99i for CRC. So I already read the super chat by Narco Republican. The next one's from Blue99i CRC 2500. General thoughts on vaporwave and general thoughts on vaporwave and the question, is it kitsch? If you could, do you know some good books on the topic of vaporwave? Well, I have to confess I don't know any books on the topic of vaporwave. I think it's about 8 years old, right? But it's not, I don't know, it's about 8 years old, but it's not something that I think scholarly work has been done on. Vaporwave does function on nostalgia. It does function. It's a very postmodern form. Like, we're going to take something and we're going to remix it, and now I think you can appreciate it as sort of a postmodern art form. The thing with music, I think this is one thing, is that music. The thing with music is that because it's a very, very visceral art form, because there's sort of an immediate reaction from the people who are listening to it, the question over whether it's kitsch or not is much more subdued. The question of kitsch, and usually the question of kitsch appears in visual arts, is where there's some kind of air or feeling around having a certain kind of art form, right? Like, I'm an artist, I'm creating great art, and then having what you're producing in this capacity be something that is very, very plebeian and easy to sell, and going kind of to the lowest common denominator. And this kind of creates the idea of kitsch, where you take on airs of being a great artist, but what you sell is derivative and predictable and obviously targeted at some demographic that's been decided up front, or that's been decided by a focus group or a marketing team. And so this is not so much an issue in movies or music where you're like viscerally enjoying the medium. There are exceptions, and a big exception, especially in the 80s and 90s, was the punk music scene, right? Where there was this whole class of people. I don't know, maybe this was a class of people, maybe it was just imagined by this community. There was a whole class of posers in the punk community that were trying to capitalize on the aesthetics and the feeling of punk without actually embracing the philosophy or the fundamentals of the music. And they were pitching things to the lowest common denominator. And this sort of precipitated in the whole question of selling out in the 90s. And if you, I don't know, people here are probably way younger than me, but if you were a teenager in the 90s, especially right around the point where Kurt Cobain killed himself, everyone was asking, like, which bands are selling out? Which bands are selling out to the record labels? Now, somewhere in between Napster and Blink-182 and pop reinventing itself, we sort of lost a concept that music could even sell out. I think probably this had to do with the ascendancy of hip-hop, which from its inception, hip-hop is explicitly, it's declared as being a mercenary endeavor. So you can't possibly sell out when it comes to hip-hop. And so I think this is one way that vaporwave, it might be good, it might be bad, but it probably will never be kitsch, because it's just it's so explicitly a ripoff. Right? Like the medium is telling you, like hip-hop's telling you, oh, I'm in this all for the money. I'm in this all for the money. Look at these fat stacks I'm getting from the record companies. You know, I'm buying all these big cars and fancy clothes and drinking champagne and, you know, all that stuff. So you can't accuse a hip-hop artist of selling out, right? And for the same reason, I don't think you can accuse vaporwave of being a nostalgic ripoff. The thing tells you on the box it's a nostalgic ripoff, right? So in sort of a postmodern fashion, it's prevented the critique from even being made. So I don't think vaporwave is repetitive. I like it. I like listening to it. It's repetitive. It's soothing. It has its moments of brilliance. It's going to get old. I think it might have already gotten old. I'm kind of getting tired of it. But I think one thing it will never be called is kitsch, because it's so explicit about itself being a copy of something from a time before. Mind's Eye for $5. Just started Jacques Allou's Technological Society. I wish it's mentioned more in NRX circles. It feels like a companion piece to Spengler. I have never read that book, and I wish I could comment on it. I only cracked Spengler, and the person I know of who's sort of the ultimate, I think the person who's constantly quoting Spengler that I talk to frequently is Morgoth of Morgoth Reviews. And I think he would be the perfect person to talk about this piece. I certainly would be interested in reading the Technological Society, but I think you're right. You know, I don't even really know that much about what it talks about, but if what you're saying is correct, then it probably sounds like I should finish Spengler before I take on that project. But again, I appreciate the super chat, so thank you very much, Mind's Eye. The Prudentialist for $20. Evening, Dave. I was wondering if I could have your blessing to do an after-action video on your upcoming debates, especially the one about democracy. Sure, absolutely, go for it. As someone who did a debate in college, I think I could do a good job. Yeah, sure. I mean, the problem with the democracy debate is I was going back and forth with Brenton for a really long time, just trying to come up with a resolution. Because I'm not really anti-democracy. You know, it's fine. It is what it is. But democracy is simply a tool. It's a method of obtaining some understanding of what the general will of a population is in a statistical sense. The problem is that we've taken democracy and we've sacralized it. I think that the best critique of democracy, which is Hans Hermann Hoppe's The God That Failed, Democracy, the God That Failed. The best critique of it also has the best title. Democracy failed because we sacralized it, because we imbued it with spiritual powers that it was never meant to have, and because it was sort of imbued with these, should I say spiritual, transcendental, or teleological properties, we never really asked hard questions about what it produces or what we should expect it to produce. And for that reason, I think, we're left in this position we find ourselves in where it's sort of funny. Everyone in America is obviously loyal to either Team Blue or Team Red. We have to do this song and dance every 4 years where we pretend that the person who gets, the slightly bigger slice of the pie, the 51% other than the 49%, or the bigger slice of the Electoral College, to be more exact, we are really loyal to the person who gets the bigger slice of that pie rather than the government that we're actually loyal to, which is our own political side, right? The side that we consider to be our friends and the side that is, more importantly, opposed to the people that we consider to be our enemies. Like Carl Schmitt said, politics is fundamentally concerning the friend-enemy distinction. And because the friend-enemy distinction has been now reconstructed on the inside of nations, and the inside specifically of the nation of the United States, no electoral proceduralism is ever going to overcome the fact that we are just plainly, politically, not loyal to the other side, regardless if they get 51% or 54% or even 60%. Regardless if they take all of the Electoral College. We have no central loyalty to the process because the process has shown itself to be perfidious and deceptive and outright injurious to the well-being of the collectives that we care about. And that's the real issue. The difficulty, I think, and what I foresee as being the difficulty with the democracy debate, unless we have to reschedule it, I foresee the difficulty being is that Brenton is gonna try to say, oh well, dictatorship sucks. That's not really the issue. The issue is you have a system. Do you know that democracy always makes it better? No. Why would you ever believe that? It's kind of ridiculous. And I guess, I hope that we can overcome sort of the resolution problems early so we can actually ask difficult questions about democracy itself. Anyway, I'll save all that for my actual debate, but thank you very much for the super chat. Yeah, go ahead. I don't think anyone ever needs to ask my blessing to do video responses or video content, using my material as a source, even if you disagree with me. I find disagreements to be great, perfectly good. I'm trying to think of the people who I've had really big disagreements with. Well, I mean, for the time being, I can think of Keith Woods. Hey, I don't have any ill will against him. None of the things we've intellectually disagreed with are really sticking points with us personally. Sometimes Keith Woods' style gets on my nerves a little bit, but, again, you don't need my blessing to do a response video or anything else like that. But again, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope we can do some work towards getting to the bottom of this democracy thing. I think what's more important, though, and this is what I will say about this, I think it's more important to make sure that the left understands just how ridiculous their adherence to democracy uber alles is. They use democracy as sort of this tonic that cures all problems, right? So they have a political system that they don't like, and what's the problem? Well, it's just not democratic enough. Well, I hate to break it to you, but if you ever engage in pure democracy, then you're going to realize really quickly that it's horrible. I don't know. I don't know how you can experience this I certainly experienced this for several years when I lived in a housing co-op in college. And you can just see this. I mean, people argue for hours over trivial amounts of money that, because everyone is sort of a quote unquote rich college student, their parents are rich, right? Or middle class at least, right? Or maybe lower middle class. But these are essentially the people who are being trained to be aristocrats, right? They all have some amount of money. Yet when a certain quantity of money is put up for debate, what should be a very easy decision is dragged on and on and on and on and on. Because what's happening is you're not debating over how to spend the money. You're debating over who has the power to be implicitly assumed in the right. The classic example I encountered in sort of my co-op experience was a disagreement about whether to buy an Xbox. Now, the money was there. It wasn't being used for anything else. And at least 40% of the house wanted it. However, and then the other 40% didn't care. But then there was a 20% contingent, right? That and they weren't called social justice warriors back then, but we would have called them social justice warriors had this been in 2014. I don't think people even call them social justice warriors now, but wokies, right? There were about 20% wokie contingent that was their objection. They had sort of this objection that, that buying an Xbox was not part of the mission of the co-op, which was socialist, and the money could be put to better use, and a bunch of other reasons for why they shouldn't get this amenity. And again, this was the house budget. This wasn't like charity money. And because of that, and it wasn't because they didn't want the Xbox. What they wanted to do is they wanted to demonstrate that their ideology that they represented could deny the house an Xbox, because then everyone would know that before anyone got any amenity they wanted, they would have to ideologically check in with them. They wanted to establish themselves as the ruling aristocrats. Of course, completely informally. I mean, if we had elected them house dictators, they probably couldn't have gotten away with that. But because this was under the cloak of democracy, they could tie up a house meeting for hours and hours and hours and hours, and essentially bleed out supporters and turn it into a giant political issue. Yes, and I think the master himself was right to point out. I say this both in Aristotle and in Mr. Yarvin. When you say politics and when you say democracy, you're pretty much talking about the same thing. And if you don't want to politicize something, then that probably means you don't want to democratize that thing either. So, anyway, yeah, I'll go on. As usual, proceeding slowly. Okay. That's the thing that's weird about Linux. The scroll buttons, the sensitivity on the trackpads is not the same. It's not easy to correct either. I mean, they have something that fixes it, but it doesn't work very well. Alice Rollins for Australian $5. Hey, I thought I'd ask a question. Do you think the church is needed for the worship of God? I'm not going to pronounce that word because you shouldn't. And Christianity in general. The church is not needed to worship God. A church is needed, however, to properly follow the words of Christ. Christ explicitly said that he was building a church. He did not write down a document. He did not create, I guess not even Muhammad created a document called the Quran, but he did not create a series of writings. He did not create a series of teachings. What he created was a church out of his disciples. And he asked them to carry down certain ceremonies that Christians call sacraments into the future, and that was the purpose of the church. And also to preserve the teachings that he gave while he was present on earth, and also as he ministered when he was risen from the dead. I don't know. If you take the evidence that was Jesus' intention to create a church, And then you substitute church for loose affiliation of individuals who have no obligation to each other or to a larger mission. I think you're kind of playing a language game of the sort of Bill Clinton variety. It depends what your meaning of it depends what the meaning of the word is. And I think that once you start playing language games with Holy Scripture, once you play language games with really any kind of moral principle, I think you're entering into really, really tough area. You're really courting nihilism, because you can play any number of language games to get the Scripture and the moral principle to say exactly what you want it to say. And you can argue your case eternally. I think when it comes to the big teachings of the Messiah, Jesus, you have to interpret his big teachings as literal, both in the sacraments that he preached while he was on earth, and also in his stated intention to create a church. And so I guess the first question is, you can worship God without a church. I don't think you can be a proper Christian without a church, because I don't think that Christ, as in Jesus the Christ, left the option of being a Christian without a church open to his followers. So I hope that's a succinct enough answer, and I will go on. Conscious Fire, you have mentioned that a reactionary community must have some means to punish hostile actors. Can you please comment on how that defense might be squared with the Christian commands to turn the other cheek? Well, I mean, I don't think turn the other cheek is you can't impose punishments on people who are trying to hurt you. I think this is another thing Christians have to get over. There's this Quaker notion, and this stems directly from this idea that you can be Christian without a church. If the church is to exist as a real political organization in the real world, then it necessarily has to, in addition to its corporeal form, it also has to have a political form. And that political form, paired along with the Great Commission, implies that in Christianity, in addition to the selflessness that it preaches, there also has to be an implicit preaching of survival, of continuation. The Christian community, and the community of all Christian nations, has to be able to collectively survive, even if some of its individual members are going to follow Christ's example and lead completely selfless lives. It is not a selfless action to take what is entrusted to you and cast it to the wind. And I think and this is something that a lot of people, and maybe Quakers during the English Civil War understood this distinction, but their followers, both literal Quakers these days and the sects of Christianity that have been highly Quakerized, by which I include all forms of progressive Christianity and progressivism generally, they all seem to have forgot this core wisdom. If you sacrifice someone or something whose good has been entrusted to you, that is not sacrificing yourself. I'm going to say this one more time. If you sacrifice something or somebody who's been entrusted to you, like it's your primary responsibility to keep this person safe, and you sacrifice that person, that is not a selfless act. That is a denial of your own responsibility, and that is a sinful act. That is a very sinful act. That, in my mind, that's almost treachery. It's not Christian to sell your children into slavery. It's not Christian to sacrifice your family, because those lives are not your own. What is your own is your moral responsibility to make sure that their well-being is looked after. And this same impetus, the same reason why you can't sell your children into slavery and then give the proceeds to charity, that's the same obligation that follows secular leaders, and most of all, I would say, leaders of the Christian religious political body. Leaders of nations and of churches, when they think about the good of the church and when they think about the good of the nation, are not thinking about the good of themselves as individuals. They're thinking about the good of lives, the goods of lives and souls that have been entrusted to them. And as such, they cannot be sacrificed. Even to the commandments that Jesus laid out on the Sermon on the Mount, because it's not a sacrifice. That was obviously not what Jesus was saying. Turn the other cheek is a notion of charity, is a notion that you must always be seeking the good of the other, even when you're opposing him as an enemy. That's not the same thing as turning your back on your duty, and that's not the same thing as sacrificing others and calling it charity. And I think we've lost that distinction. I think we've sort of bent charity to the purpose of treachery. And of course, there are people who want to make all of their lives completely dedicated to the concept of turn the other cheek, right? Those people are monks. And what do we do with monks? We do not entrust them with families. We do not entrust them with the leadership of churches. I'm talking about monastics here, not priests. And as such, they can completely follow this element of Jesus' teachings to the T. But once you take on the responsibility of being a shepherd and looking out for someone else, you can't just destroy your sheep and call it sacrifice, because it's not. So I hope that's clear, and forgive me for going on, but it's, I guess, more, to your more practical side of your question. This really depends on what we have currently. Right now, we're just trying to get a community off the ground. So the only thing we could ever enforce is our choice of who to associate with and who to not associate with. That's really the only tools we have for enforcing anything right now. I think the question of how do you enforce or punish bad behavior changes as your political power changes. And so, I can't really give you a definitive answer for that. But all I can say is, for now, we need to make sure that we only associate ourselves with people who are actually good actors. Maybe I should re-underline that. That's something that's not said. If we're going to win anything in this culture war, it's going to be we are basically going to win it because we have high quality individuals that can morally follow principles. We want high quality individuals. We don't want some kind of mass movement comprised of people who are the lowest common denominator. And I think this is what, and maybe we'll discuss this later, this is what the left is quickly turning into, is just a clearing area for the lowest of the lowest common denominator. And that's never going to be how any right-wing or conservative or religious thing is ever going to be accomplished. And so I don't want right-wingers to come up with reasons not to work together, or to come up with reasons why they should hate each other or why they should infight. But what I am asking people to do is to try to consciously associate with the people who are morally and intellectually the best, or as good as you know, because they will encourage you to do greater things in yourself, and it's only through those types of people that will ever be able to make a lasting mark. I see questions about the Benedict option, but I might table those until I'm a little bit further into the super chats. Otherwise, I'm going to be seriously running the risk of not being able to answer everything on my plate. Maybe I can go through after those things are done. I know every time I see this, people are like, "Oh, it's so late," and I want to say I sympathize. But this is just the place I'm in my life. It's a full day. It's a full day, and you can only get to this at around 9 or so. Okay, let's see. Okay, here's an interesting one, although I'm probably not going to answer it for very long. Qwerty, what do you think about the theory of evolution? How do you square it with Christianity? Pardon me. Okay, so I don't want to sound like a moderate here in any way, but I'm going to say that I'm a person who believes both in Christianity, in the Orthodox form, and also in evolution. I think that really the idea, and this is something, I do not believe that Christianity relies on the literal veracity of Genesis as foundational to its existence. We have to rely on the spiritual reality of original sin, but maybe this is just my own predilection towards theological cracked pottery. But for some reason, evolution, and even the nature of evolution, never seem to really be at odds with the concept of original sin. And I'm not saying that I have an exact narrative about how, in a natural history sense, the flawedness of humanity came to pass. But what I am saying is that the fundamental theological wisdom, that symbolically man's spiritual nature and his spiritual calling is entirely mismatched to his physical inclinations at a level so deep we can't even conceptualize it, and that our own decisions over the course of history and in our own lives have reinforced this, and indeed are as part of ourselves as our eyes or our ears or our lungs. To me, that concept never seemed to be not at home in a world where evolution also existed. Now, I'll say this, and I can't get into all these things here. Now, when I was, when I was Catholic, I got this really great parish. I was in a really great parish in Seattle, and one time before that. And when I was in these great parishes, and you always know great parishes because they're full of young people who love talking about theology and love brewing beer, and you can get into like hours and hours and hours of conversation about theology with fellow Catholics, and that was just an amazing time. And if you're ever in one of those parishes, you really need to cherish your time there because they're few and far between in our present era. But when I was there, we used to have a big, people used to brew their own beer, and we used to read theology books every Friday night. One of these questions about the nature of original sin and evolution in natural history, that frequently came up, and people had all sorts of crackpot theories that reconciled them, and I liked quite a few of them. To be quite honest with you, I do not think that the existence of an evolutionary natural history, or the existence of an evolutionary force in human history as we see it today, I do not think that is poisonous or a defeater of the most orthodox version of Catholicism or Christianity. I'm not a theologian, so I can't say, fight me on it, but I think that this is... I don't think that should be a reason for discarding Christianity. So I'm going to go on, but thank you very much, Qwerty, for the donation, and I'll keep on going here. Red6UA, too. I might join a young Republican group. Thoughts? Oh, I think joining any group is really great. I'm pro joining things. As a general, I think that we're way too isolated in present year. I guess a Republican group is as good as any. The only thing I would really caution against is getting sucked into the sort of propaganda of the Republican Party TM. The Republican Party TM, where you're constantly convincing yourself that the cyber Reaganism of 1989 is the eternal, ever-burning spirit of America, and it will reemerge and grant constant victories to the conservative adherents of this spirit. That all is bullshit. I think it's post-Trump. I think it's transparently bullshit. I'll say that. I'm not so sure how anyone ever believed it, quite frankly, but I'm sure, the 80s and the early 90s was a different country. So I guess, ideologically, I'd be careful about that. The only other thing I would say is the Republican Party is in a weird position right now. The Democrats know that they need to keep it in existence in order to survive. They know about they know that they need to they know that they can't be a one-party state, but at the same time they haven't given the Republican Party any reason to exist that isn't transparently idiotic. So your reason for being a Republican, on the political stage is from the Democratic point of view, from the people who actually rule this country's point of view, is to be the more racist party that gets blamed for everything, that's never in power, and that never can achieve anything because it's constantly giving its power away to the Democrats and making institutions controlled by the Democrats more and more powerful in this present era. I don't know. I mean, it's an... And, I can't exactly say what will come out of this, right? I don't know the kind of people who are going to be attracted to the Republican Party in the next 20 years. It's almost impossible to say. The people who will be attracted to the Republican Party in the next 20 years is literally going to be decided in the next 2 months. Depending on the exact actions Trump takes, will decide everything about what the Republican Party is. So the Republican Party of 2 weeks ago is not going to be the same Republican Party as the Republican Party of 3 weeks from now. So I don't know exactly what to say, but I just joined and see what you can make of it. All right, guys, I'm going to have to grab a glass of water. Again, I'm poorly prepared, but forgive me for one more away from the microphone moment, but I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Again, sorry for the away from microphone moments, but that will have to do. Now I'm actually checking to make sure this thing isn't muted this time. Yeah, I mean, just go. I think if you have a young Republicans group, just show up. It'll be an interesting ride nonetheless, right? But I don't think anyone really knows what the Republican Party is right now. It's some outer apparatus of whoever rules the mainstream of our society. But we don't know what its role is going to be in the future. And of course, the vision of Ronald Reagan and all those people, I mean, that's been dead. It's been dead at least since 2012. Probably well before that. Okay, so Ron Wood for $5. Where is a good place to start for someone who's been jaded by seemingly hyper-autistic uni-epistemology? Didn't want to ignore it just because I dislike it. Well, you mean like... There's no way I can really sit that's not kind of hunched over. This I'm kind of half on the carpet and half not with this chair, so I always want to sit in a natural way. But I assume, Ron Wood, that you're talking about the kind of authors you encounter, like Foucault and some people who are considered Derrida and people considered postmodernists. I never read Derrida. I read a few things by Foucault. oddly enough, in high school. It's been a long time. I was in the debate club, and believe it or not, there was like this critique. I won't explain what that is exactly, but there's a critique that relied on Foucault. And so I had to kind of wade into that a little bit to figure out what he was all about. But I assume what this question means is that you've been disillusioned by questions of relativism and power and just sort of the cynical nature of our political world, right? Okay, I mean, my suggestion is to go outside and have real experiences. There's sort of Foucault, in my opinion, and this is coming from somebody who's not well read in Foucault, and what little he did read comes from longer ago than I'd like to admit on this live stream. But, these people like Foucault, and especially people who quote him, who I'm more aware of, they occupy a weird place where they're basically in a constant dialogue over the nature of power and the nature of political systems and concepts like human rights and all this stuff. But that's not real. And this is the problem is that you get very, very jaded about things like human rights and democracy and power relations. And it seems like everyone is cynical, or maybe you don't even know what's true or not, right? Like what promises, what objects if democracy is not real, what else in this world could possibly be something we could put our faith in? To me, this is kind of strange because in a way it's closer to the truth than anything like Marx, right? Or any progressive thought that was sort of popular in the early 20th century. The early 20th century progressives were obsessed with these notions of equality and rights and democracy and all this stuff. All of these fictions of the Enlightenment that everyone before the Enlightenment knew were bullshit, and they were kind of a passing illusion of a very particular class in Europe and North America during that time. And in some sense, people like Foucault are more realistic about power. But in my mind, they don't go all the way, and they don't go directly to Machiavelli, right? The result of realizing that all power is cynically wielded and that all political systems are essentially the friend-enemy distinction played out over a power question, the end result of that should only make you cynical if you believe in strange concepts like democracy and equality to begin with. What people need to do before they engage in politics is discover some kind of teleological or moral or aesthetic obligation that motivates them to enter politics to begin with. Before you enter, politics is just war. It's just a fight. But you're wondering why you're cynical over a fight when you don't even know what you're fighting for. Because for the last 100 years, we've convinced ourselves that the purpose of a fight was to throw uppercuts or jabs and to stop people from throwing haymakers. Well, the uppercut's not working anymore. And this whole idea that you'd enter a fight so that you could do a certain move in a fight is transparently ridiculous, and people are right to point out that it's just a power. The point of a fight's to win, right? That's the thing. But if you're feeling cynical in the fight, it's because you don't know what you're fighting for. And no amount of studying martial arts is ever going to give you something to fight for. That can only be obtained through religion or through certain aesthetic or spiritual experiences with the real world. Or, I will also say, certain relationships. You need to come in contact with the true, the good, and the beautiful. In a context that's not depoliticized, but is super political. If you go out and have a radical experience with a painting that you consider to be beautiful, or if you have family relationships that you consider to be sacred, or if you have a spiritual experience reading a poem, or even reading scripture, which is, a lot of scripture is poetry itself, so I repeat myself, that begins to open up things to fight for, reasons to fight for something. And that immediately recontextualizes politics. Because once you have an aesthetic vision of the good, or just a vision of the good, a vision of the beautiful, a vision of truth that transcends just descriptions of political relationships, you can approach politics from a truly pragmatic view. Relativists can't do this. They're obsessed with forms. They're obsessed with forms. They're obsessed with words when we get right down to it. They've fallen in love with their own language. And because of that, they seek to procure a political system that will allow them to use their favorite words in a certain way that, if we're really honest, flatters their own ego. People aren't against racism because they're afraid of people doing some kind of action. People, for the most part, if we're being really cynical here, they're against racism because they've become particularly enamored of this thing called the civil rights movement, where democracy defeated totalitarianism and bigotry. And that, the love of that story and the love of the language that surrounded that story has caused them to twist the language itself so that they could have this story over again in a contemporary environment, regardless of whether they were actually fighting against bigotry or fighting for bigotry. And that's really entrapped them. In order to be a truly pragmatic political player, you have to understand what you love in a super political way. And that's sort of something that's something I never got from Foucault. It's the obvious next step, right? The obvious next step of saying that politics is purely about power is then to ask, well, who are the belligerents in this war of power? And why should I be loyal to one of these belligerents or the other? I suppose one answer would be that you think that side's going to win. But then you just sort of get into this weird sort of self-referential question. What comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? A person with a teleological understanding of the good can engage in pure struggles of power without having to necessarily go into these endless postmodernist deviations. And so I think the only solution is to return to that primal and aesthetic approach to politics. That's the only alternative. Ron Wood, I have to confess, I don't know whether you're talking about like the complete utter, like, I don't know if I exist. I don't know if reality exists. If you're talking about the complete skepticism, that's a harder question to answer. All I can say, if you're talking about the complete skepticism, is just play a Pascal's wager with yourself. Go outside and kick a rock, and then ask yourself if you think, you want to bet for or against that rock existing and coming in contact with your toe at high speeds. I think that at some point we have to sort of put an end to the endless deviations of autism and get things done. And one of those things is just to kind of tell Bishop Berkeley to stick it. But I digress. Boris P. for $5. What do you think about the idea that comfy pastoral neo-traditionalism is just collapse cope? Just like minimalism, downsizing, or veganism. Well, the problem is that you can call anything cope, right? I mean, anything that doesn't net you power is cope. So, I mean, like, we could tie this into the next one, right? So, like, let's say I decide that the purpose of, like, I love my family. Like, defense of the family is my transcendent good, which it is certainly one of them, right? And then I go into a political battle to defend my family, and I say, I don't care. And someone comes up to me and says, oh, hey, don't you know, the side that doesn't want to murder your family is going to lose. I mean, the side that wants to save your family from death is going to lose. Like, so you should really change your side, dude. Like, change your side to the pro-killing family's side. And I tell them to, like, fuck off, right? Right? Like, oh, you should join the side that wants to kill your family and all your relatives because it's going to win. And then when you tell them to screw themselves, you don't care who's going to win, you're going to fight if need be to the death, they'll say like, oh, that's cope. That's cope. You don't want to admit that you're going to lose. You're just trying to cope. You're trying to cope with the fact you don't want to change your position. No. Right? Having values and having things that you love and having things that you're willing to fight for, even if you lose, you could call it cope. You could call Jesus on the cross cope. You could call the death of Joan of Arc cope. You could call all the heroic deaths in battle over the course of human history cope. Cope, cope, cope. Anytime anyone sacrifices for his family, anytime anyone does something selfless, anytime someone arrays themselves against the powerful and for the needy, oh, it's cope, it's cope, it's cope, it's cope, it's cope, it's cope. You could always call it cope. But that's not really what that is. I mean, I guess, it might, from the outside, you could always call it that, but that's not really what it is. It's something much more beautiful and much more meaningful. In order to be cope, what someone has to be doing is turning away from a greater good, in my opinion. Somebody who loses their job and starts playing video games, that is a cope, right? Because the greater good is to search for another job to support your family. The lesser good is entertaining yourself playing video games. So the key difference between, a cope and a sacrifice for a greater principle is that the sacrifice is saying there's something I care about more than power. And the person who's coping is saying, I know that this is a lesser good than the thing that I'm losing at. But because fighting for the thing that I'm losing at is hard, I'd rather do this thing that's comforting me and that I know is a lesser good because it's easier. That's a cope. Changing your principles for political expediency is a cope. Ignoring your politics and telling yourself you're going to win because you can't come to terms with losing is a cope. But abandoning the flag you're fighting for, or not abandoning the flag you're fighting for, rather, that's not a cope. That's just being a mature adult. I don't know what exactly neo-traditionalism you're talking about is. If it's neo-traditionalism in the sense that I mean it, in the sense that I think my identity as a father is more meaningful than my identity as a YouTuber or my identity as a board game player, then I think if it's traditionalism in that sense, then I think that is just an eternal principle, and I will fight to the death for that principle. And I don't care if it loses. I don't care if people like Vaush and Zent and ContraPoints are going to be victorious over me. I mean, I care that they're going to be victorious, but that's not going to change my affiliation. I'd rather die fighting people. I'd rather die fighting bugmen like Vaush and Jeff Bezos and ContraPoints and all these other people that make bank off the internet and really throw the things that are more important to the wind. That affiliation is not cope. Now, if you're talking about like looking at pictures of like anime girls and dirndls or blonde-haired women wandering through wheat fields, that kind of Twitter neo-traditionalism, now we're getting more to cope, right? If you're pining over the virgin waifu on Instagram, as opposed to actually doing the hard and necessary steps of pursuing more imperfect mates in the real world, now that is getting to what I think a legitimate definition of cope is. So, okay, I spent too long on this question, but thank you very much. Oh, this is such a good question. Last things for $3. Ooh, this is a good one. You misspelled this person's name, but I know who you mean. Neil Gaiman, based or cringed? I loved Neil Gaiman in high school. He was one of my go-to authors. And he can still write a really good story. So for people who don't know who Neil Gaiman is, Neil Gaiman was a comic artist in the 1990s and 1980s who did a great series called Sandman, who, if you're looking for, one of those 1990s, 1980s comic book is art thing like Watchmen, for my money, Sandman was better than Watchmen. It was more interesting. It was more diverse. It was how I first encountered G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton. He was actually a character in that book, funnily enough. But after he wrote comics, he went on to write screenplays, and he wrote a number of books that were then adopted into movies quite successfully, and he kind of became a celebrity among the British fantasy. Excuse me. The British fantasy audience. I don't know, I'm out of water. Excuse me. I need to get some more water. Okay, well, I'll finish this question. And of course, this audience is the audience that liked Neil Gaiman. The fans of Neil Gaiman were also fans of people like Doctor Who. And they're all also fans of people like Terry Pratchett. And these are the people who watched BBC productions religiously. And I think you know where I'm going with this. And Neil Gaiman married, I think I'm going to get this person's name wrong. Is it Amy Palmer? The singer from the Dresden Dolls. He married her, and she's like a total progressive wokey, right? And since then, he's been generating stuff that's been really kind of flattering to progressive sensibilities. Now, I'll say this. Neil Gaiman, in the 80s and 90s, he was well-read enough for his progressive sensibilities to kind of see into reality and puncture it. And so, because of that, you'd get stories like The Sandman, which, although its politics was explicitly progressive and it had many progressive messages inside of it, every now and again you'd have ancient wisdom bubbling up from the surface because Neil Gaiman read older sources. He understood what older mythology was like, and because he wanted to write that in, he naturally included ancient wisdom mixed in with progressive platitudes. Now, I've noticed that has decreased and decreased and decreased. Oh, someone's telling me it's Amanda Palmer, right? Okay, well, that's his wife's name. Forgive me, but I'll continue. So the thing with Neil Gaiman is he understood sort of this older wisdom a lot more when he was younger, and I think he sort of turned a blind eye to it. And the progressive messages have become more prominent and the ancient wisdom more subdued. The stuff that he learned from G.K. Chesterton and older authors has fallen into the background. But that being said, every now and again, he's able to come up with something that I think is truly brilliant. The last thing he did that I really liked was Coraline, which was turned into a really good claymation movie. Was it 10 years ago? Oof. God, I'm feeling really old. Yeah, it was 10 years ago. It was turned into a really great claymation movie. And I'll give you an example of this is Neil Gaiman at his best. When Neil Gaiman is not talking about things that have to do with politics or writing stories that intersect with politics, he's always at his best. He's also always at his best when he's doing horror. Because horror is naturally a realistic or reactionary or right-wing genre. And Coraline sort of underlines Neil Gaiman at his best. And so Coraline, and I'll give a little synopsis here. It's a classic Alice in Wonderland, this disenchanted girl who's living in she's living around Portland in one of these Victorian mansions that actually do exist in Northern California and in Oregon. And she discovers this secret door, and behind the secret door is a mirror world where what seems like a better version of her parents and a better version of reality itself exists. And what proceeds is your classic sort of Alice in Wonderland. I'm exploring this new world. My parents don't believe me that this other world exists, and I have this access to this fantastic place, and so on and so on and so forth. And you know it's going to take a darker twist. And I think it's in the darker twist that Neil Gaiman really shines. I think what makes Coraline better than I think what another writer of Neil Gaiman's class, who is Neil Gaiman, is the fact that when the twist happens and it's revealed that the other world is evil, and the other mother who lives in the other world is actually someone who wants to doom Coraline, or the heroine, they don't pull their punches. They don't go like, oh, well, it's a bad world, but maybe it's a little bit good on the side. No, this other world and the creature that inhabits it, posing as her mother, is a demon straight out of hell. And it has a desire only to consume the people that fall into its grasp. And so what's sort of funny is that Coraline sort of thinks she's a modern cynical girl, and she thinks that she's in a modern fairy tale. She thinks she's in a fairy tale that has a more cute ending, but she actually ends up in the clutches of something that's more evil than fairy tale logic would even permit. It seems like it's playing by fairy tale rules, but it will break its own rules. It's simply a predator out to devour her. And so that is sort of Neil Gaiman at his best. It's actually pronounced Gaiman, by the way, which must have been horrible for him when he was a kid. But the thing is, what makes Coraline great is that when Coraline thinks she's puncturing a hole from our boring reality to a fantastical one where magic exists. But what she's actually doing is she's puncturing the fake modern world, and she's discovered a world where real spiritual consequences exist, where when you turn your back on your parents, there's a demon ready to devour your soul. And that demon isn't playing nice or by any kind of constrained set of rules. And because of that, I think it communicates something much, much more deeper than you might imagine. So to answer your question, last things, the answer is Neil Gaiman is both based and cringe. You just have to find the right Neil Gaiman, and you have to make sure that when he's writing to actually tell a story and not to make a political point. So that's my advice. Okay. That reminds me, I have half of that Shrek video recorded, and I never recorded the second half. It was like a really good stopping point too, so I can pick it up from my notes at any time. But, wow, yeah, that's TK22 Tungusta for $20. Wow, thank you very much. A series on reactionary themes in Warhammer 40k would be a good way not only to illustrate these ideas in a new light, but also to reach people who would otherwise ignore reactionary ideas on their face. Avoids tiresome current events. Well, that's kind of funny. During this lockdown, my wife and I have been painting some Dungeons and Dragons minis, and I accidentally acquired some wargaming minis from eBay secondhand. But of course, at the rate I'm going, I might play the game in 20 years. But it doesn't mean I can't appreciate it as a pastime. So reactionary themes in Warhammer 40k. The problem with Warhammer 40k is if reactionary themes if reactionary themes were wood, the world of Warhammer 40k would essentially be beating you over the head with a telephone pole. You can't consume anything in that universe. Every single element of that universe is Warhammer. Every single element in the universe of Warhammer and Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k is explicitly reactionary. It's explicitly taken from fairy tales and mythology of right-wing religions, which are all religions in their primal state, and sort of real spiritual reality. And as such, it's very hard to point out something that isn't obviously right-wing. Now, that being said, there are all of these kind of... I've noticed something, and I've watched a few 40k channels, like Warhammer channels, because I love hearing about the war, the Warhammer lore, the lore. I love hearing about the lore. So every now and again I check out, guilty pleasure. Don't judge me, guys. Don't judge me. I check out the lore of Warhammer 40k, and I noticed that even inside this this explicitly reactionary universe where hell exists and original sin exists and the universe hangs in balance of self-sacrifice, and all the aliens want to destroy humanity, and in every moment's a constant struggle for survival, and everyone needs to be right-wing. Especially among British channels that deal with the lore, there's this weird retcon, and the weird retcon is, the Messiah, who in Warhammer 40k is known as the Emperor. The retcon is the Messiah is actually a fedora-tipping atheist who wanted to get rid of religion, even though, keep in mind, every single thing human religion ever taught humanity is exactly correct and exactly what humanity needed to know and do. Even though religion is completely correct about spiritual reality and the reality of human survival in an uncaring universe, even though religion is right, the Messiah was still a hat-tipping fedora. And it was only like the crazy religions around him that created the future as it exists, which is highly theocratic, right? And in this retcon, the real heroes of the story are this alien race called the Tau, which essentially are an exaggerated version of liberal humanism with a bunch of Asiatic themes thrown in for good measure, and those are the heroes of the story. And of course, this retcon essentially tries to unlearn every kind of hard reactionary theme that exists inside this universe. And it also completely deflavors the universe. If you accept that retcon, the universe had hope in the new atheist movement of the early 2000s, and that was dashed. And since then, humanity's just been tossed to the winds of religious persuasions, and it makes absolutely no sense. I don't know. I mean, it's a good idea, but I don't know. I feel like explaining reactionary ideas in Warhammer 40k is explaining. You're basically not preaching to most people who see the story of Warhammer 40k will internalize its reactionary messages unless they're intentionally trying to not learn them. That's why I want to answer this question, right? So because it's so explicit, if you're going to make a video that's like, this is why Warhammer 40k is reactionary, well, the only people you're really addressing are just the progressives and new atheists, people who play it and consume the product, that are explicitly trying to unlearn it. Most normal people, when they interact with that world, understand that the circumstances they're describing are real, or at least were real for humanity at one point, to be charitable. Like, you can believe that this is how things were for humanity in an earlier stage, and that the right-wing reaction that's being manifested by humanity in this fictional future would be the correct one to deal with the manifest issue of survival. But thank you very much for that that super chat. I'm going to have to go on. Someone asked me a question on the dashboard. I'm going to try to get to that later because it's not a super chat and I'm already really, really well behind. So for TK22 Tungusta for $5, also an analysis of Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò's address would be excellent to hear from your perspective. Well, okay. In 2018, right after I was married, that's when the first big Viganò scandal happened. And I remember it because we were driving down on our honeymoon from Seattle to California, and I was just consuming all of this stuff with the latest round of Pope Francis scandals. And I was just furious. Oh my God, I couldn't. I found Viganò's testimony to be incredibly believable, and I still think that he is more believable than his critics are. And I didn't know what to say. My understanding is, even if Viganò is embellishing, which is not out of the question, he's certainly talking about some reality here that's accurate, right? And to be clarified for people who are not familiar, Viganò is essentially blowing the whistle on Pope Francis, saying that, well, I need to be very clear with these accusations, but it was insinuated that Pope Francis essentially soft-pedaled a bunch of Vatican leadership that were knowingly involved in either these pedophile scandals or the cover-up of these pedophile scandals because they were political allies of his more progressive interpretation of Catholicism. This accusation would be hugely scandalous. It wouldn't destroy my faith in Catholicism, but it would certainly prove Pope Francis to be among the more corrupt popes in history, and I think they're taken very, very seriously. Here's the problem. And now I say this right after kind of speculating that I am sympathetic with Viganò's interpretation of this. I really, really, really do not like starting inter-Catholic knife fights in public. All I will say is that I think Viganò is saying the truth, even though he might be embellishing through innocent misremembering. I'm not saying that everyone who Viganò is accusing is guilty, and I definitely think that his vision for the church is more correct than his adversaries. But that being said, all I can say is that I want to pray for the appropriate leaders of the Vatican to take the right action. I do not believe it is appropriate for me as a layperson to go behind the backs of cardinals and to try to organize political campaigns to try to delegitimize elements of the church when I'm not in full possession of the facts. The most important thing I think for people like me to do is to work as hard as I can to build up my community and to build up my church, with the hope that when the Holy Spirit comes to bear on the church and the corruption is rooted out through the appropriate channels, we're ready to take that new dispensation from the Holy Spirit and make as much of it as possible in our fallen world. And I guess that is sort of why, again, while I have my suspicions and my preferences, I try to steer away from that topic. Now, guys, I'm sorry I need to get water again because my voice is going, but be patient. Oh, sorry, I think that I killed the. Oh well. Oh well. Oh well. Oh well. I'm back and forgot to turn off the camera, but that's fine. Anyway, where was I? Okay, more super chats. Let's keep on going because otherwise I'm going to be left in the dust here. Oh yeah. Okay. So Junk Bucket for $5 said, you had some lockdown family blogs where you mentioned the good films and media you liked. Is there a way to still watch them? I need the recommendations. Okay, I'll do this afterwards. I was going to post them on my wife's YouTube channel, but I don't have the password. I guess I'll have to do this when she wakes up. I need her password and then access to her account while I re-upload them. They were really not well received videos. It was really weird. We sort of gave our top, I think it was our top favorite movies from the last 20 years. And we were going to do more of them where we had things like our favorite classical music of all time, our favorite pop music of all time, and our favorite folk music of all time, and all those sorts of things. But we kind of got off the pattern of the series. But I will try to re-upload those on her channel. I know I promised this, but thank you for the reminder. And I'm going to go on Junk Puppet because I need to kind of keep this going. Wow, my cough. I got the dry cough here. Redacted for Australia, $10. The issue is the narrative. Democratic elections give reps the right to rule through the will of the people. If the narrative fails, the system collapses and things get scary. Well, I mean, that's absolutely true. But here's the problem. Even if Trump, regardless of who wins this election, Trump or Biden, the narrative for me and the narrative for an increasingly large number of Americans is already shot. And because of that, I don't know. I think if democratic elections are all about constructing a collective narrative, I think if that's the case, then democracy is already on its last legs and may already have completely failed because no one is going to legitimate the government in a direction that doesn't correspond with their own political side. Nick J for $5. Hey Dave, maybe you can have a video on this. I haven't seen. Pardon me. Hey Dave, maybe you have a video on this I haven't seen, but I wonder if you have any thought on the role of artists and art in today's communities. Well, I don't think I have one video on this. I'll say that. I don't think I have one video on artists or art. I don't exactly know how to answer this question. It's very difficult for me because I know that artists are always kind of in a hard position in times like our own because artists rely on commissions and patronage from elites, and they also rely on having some fierce contact with the truth. And I believe quite strongly that our political class, and more importantly, our political funding class, is completely disconnected from reality. And as such, an artist is always going to have a hard time on the right getting the necessary funds, and he's always going to have a hard time saying something interesting on the left. And I'm not so sure exactly what the niche is for this. I think if I were to guess, I would guess that the niche is going to come when the progressives eventually succeed in just what people used to call pausing every single intellectual property. What's really holding back the explosion of right-wing art, in my opinion, is intellectual property. I know I'm not one of these people who thinks like all intellectual property is bad, but I do think that intellectual property needs to have a very strictly enforced statute of limitations. And because of this, because of this, I think what's really standing in the way is that we have, our imaginations collectively, our collective mythology, which ordinarily would kind of lead us back into more reactionary and more realistic truths, is fundamentally hidden behind corporate IP. And the corporation is always going to go to the left. The corporation, like all institutions of collected power, is naturally going to move to the left. So as it stands, as it stands, and I mean, Warhammer is sort of, maybe Warhammer is not the best example. Star Trek might be a better example. Well, okay, I mean, so last night my wife watched the last episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, which I consider to be I consider Star Trek The Next Generation to be a great show. Even though the point of Star Trek is to essentially make the case that liberal progressivism is humanity's future. It's great because it actually gives the reactionary voice its due in the form of Q, in the form of the adversary. And as such, it tells the truth more about the challenges that face progressive liberalism. And in the story of Star Trek The Next Generation is the story of progressive liberalism overcoming that challenge in the form of Q overcoming, in the form of Picard overcoming Q. The difficulty is that we've progressed to a point where we can't have that conflict anymore. Not only is Star Trek thoroughly progressive, I guess it always was, but it's kind of become, its modes of communicating a message have become thoroughly polluted by really explicitly propagandistic messages inside its own art. And they're really, really hard to miss if you look at something like Discovery or whatnot, right? And in the meantime, the interesting avenues that were more right-wing, that it was toying with, like Deep Space Nine, it can never go down those avenues, even though fans might be more interested in them, because the corporation that controls Star Trek in this case has no incentive to actually explore that. So I don't know. I think what's going to happen is that the intellectual properties in the mainstream are going to have to be, are going to be completely destroyed by the companies that manage them, and in the wake of that, there's going to be an opening up as people explicitly walk away from intellectual property and they just make their own. I'll say this to connect it to the previous question. Everyone knows that the grim darkness of the 41st millennia is only going to be the grim darkness for so much longer. We know how this is going to work. They're going to make female space marines. Those space marines are going to have to be even more badass than the male space marines. They're going to have social justice messages inserted inside this entirely brutal imperium that's obviously supposed to be a description and partial vindication of a right-wing system of government. And because of that, because this is the way the company is going, they're going to slowly undermine the nature of their own world and the nature of it communicating the truths that it was trying to communicate when people first imagined it. And I don't think this is really going to hurt the hobby. What I think people are going to do is they're just going to create their own mythology and use that universe instead. Now, I'm sure Games Workshop is going to try to sue them. And I always, whenever I worry about, ripping something off from Games Workshop, just remind yourself that you're probably paying Games Workshop the same royalties that they're paying Frank Herbert for ripping off half their concepts from Dune, right? But eventually people are going to just have to break free of these IPs and do their own thing. And when they do that, there's going to be a new role for artists. I think that beyond what we ever really imagined previously, because we're just so constrained by the apparatuses that already exist now. Okay, so Dogfish for $5. Do you think that the idea of techno-skeptics like Jacques Ellul should have a greater place in NRX spaces given the rise of woke tech finance? Well, this is the same person that I said I didn't read earlier, but I'm going to sort of contextualize this. Oh God, no! I've read Uncle Ted, Industrial Society and its Discontents, and I'm very sympathetic to it, right? But I don't think. How should I put this? And there's also that Keith Woods. Keith Woods has been on about this anarcho-primitivist author that he's been talking about for quite some time. I'm blanking on his name. The guy had this really great takedown of the LGBT movement. So that's interesting. But they are out there and they are very respectable. Another person might be who toys with this is Luke Smith, who is among my favorite YouTubers, both a Linux blogger and in some sense a reactionary blogger. And I see Unism in the chat too. I don't even know what Unism is, but I get the sense that it's a techno-skepticism type idea. This is my position. It's always been my position that the only way humanity survives is if we radically reconceptualize our relationship with technology. The fact that it's new and technological does not mean that it's good. We're going to have to look at some things and say no. The big challenge right now is that Twitter, or the force that it represents, has to be neutered in a political fashion. We can't have politics done through Twitter in the way that it's being done. We can't keep living like this. That's what I always say. That's the message of 2020 is we can't keep living like this. And Twitter is a great example. Now people like Mencius Moldbug think that Twitter is just representation of democracy and we can't cancel Twitter because it's technology, so we have to cancel democracy. And that might be the case, right? Another possibility might be that we have to put some kind of strict limitation on social media in the same way that the Chinese do, but perhaps in a less nefarious way, perhaps in a less politically motivated way. And that's another option. But at some level, we're going to have to limit this technology explicitly in order to save our own humanity. That's the only way we can survive as a species. And this is something that really humanity hasn't even thought about for 200 years. We have completely discarded this possible need, this question, this whole line of questions. Is this technology good? It's a whole category of questions we just never have asked or answered in the 19th or 20th century, ever since the Luddites. And we need to start answering it now or humanity is doomed. And because of that, even though I'm pro-technology, in some capacities, we need to invite techno-skeptics to be part of the conversation on the right. They need to have a chair. They can't be the only voice, but they need to be a voice in the conversation. And together with them, we need to sort of separate out the lambs from the goats, or the sheep from the goats. Is that how the expression goes? I think it's the sheep from the goats, but you get the idea. I mean, I think Linux is beautiful, and one of the reasons why I like Luke Smith, Luke Smith, he's this anti-technology guy, but at the same time, he's a Linux geek, right? He's a Linux geek. So, in my mind, one of the reasons why I like Luke Smith so much is that he's a perfect marriage of these two concepts. And I see, like I said, I see Unism in the chat, and I get the sense that Unism, the channel, is seeking some kind of middle way, in some sense along the lines of Luke. And Luke Smith doesn't really have a theory of this, but in the way that Luke Smith is embodying in his own life. To Luke Smith and to me, technology should be something that is good, but is only good if you control it. I would feel much better about things like Warhammer and Magic the Gathering and all of these nerdy hobbies that I'm kind of, attracted to. I'll be honest, I'm attracted to them, right? I'd feel much better if I 100% made them myself. if I built my own pieces, if I printed my own playing cards, if I built my own hobby tables, and to a certain extent, I do that stuff, right? But if it was 100% controlled and managed by me, if it was for my own community and by my own community, I would feel much safer with that. And as it stands right now, however, that's not the case. These objects are being run by corporations, and they're being run to enslave us. Computers are being run to enslave us. Social media is being run to enslave us. Nerdy hobbies like Warhammer and Magic the Gathering are being run to enslave us. And I like technology, and I like social media, and I like nerdy card games. This is what between the three of them, they're my hobby, my passion, and my career choice in the real world. It all revolves around these technologies. But the conversation has to be, how do we use these technologies so that they don't use us? All right. Thank you very much for that question, and I'm going to keep on going. Okay. I started thinking about woke finance. I think that's a whole other can of worms that I've answered previously, so I chose to go the other direction with that question. Dogfish for $5. Do you think that the ideas of... Wait, I just entered that one. Okay, pardon me. The right reaction for $10. Thank you very much. PBWU. Peace be with you. Okay, thank you. Peace be with you. Well, peace be with you as well. Is it better for us to step away from the left-right dichotomy and focus on attacking Build Back Better as a proxy for global homo in the cathedral? Well, I mean, I guess. I mean, the problem is that left versus right, I believe, does represent something that is real. The right represents order. The left represents a removal of order, a destruction of orders. Sometimes the left wing is necessary, but the left wing usually is a force of destruction. And because of that, I don't think that it's really up to us to... We can't necessarily walk away from the right-wing, left-wing dichotomy just because we want to. That being said, it is absolutely imperative that we build bridges with the left and even the radical left. Now, about, 8 months ago, I think when I was on my second Discord account, we were talking about making alliances with the left, and someone recorded it and acted like it was a big scandal, making alliances between the distant right and the classic people who are classically interested in worker rights and social justice, like that's some kind of thing we should be ashamed of or something. This has been an explicit thing I've talked about on this channel again and again and again and again. And I'll say it again here in public. And we absolutely need to be thinking not about building alliances to people like Dinesh D'Souza, but building alliances to people like Angela Nagel. Because Angela Nagel, she is someone who's a socialist, but she's someone who's a socialist because she actually cares about working class communities. She sees socialism as a means to an end and not an end to itself. And so she's always going to pick the community over the tool used to procure that community's benefit. And because of that, I know I can trust her. So, I mean, yeah, we need to kind of... we need to be thinking out of the box, and that's certainly a component of it. One thing I will say, and I wanted to actually make this into a slide deck, the Build Back Better stuff, the Great Reset stuff. Okay, this is an intervention. I know I constantly give these things, but maybe this will be a magical words video. I thought that series was done, but maybe I'll resurrect it. So as you know, the Great Reset. So what is it? So the Great Reset is a theory developed by someone called Klaus Schwab, who works for an NGO called the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is one of these Davos set of organizations that essentially rub elbows with all world leaders and have been talking about the future of humanity and mankind for basically the last 30 years. And, this is a conversation that people like us and the people like really anyone in politics really aren't privy to. Now, is this a conspiracy? No, absolutely not. These people, this theory is explicit. It's on paper. They give talks about it. And they essentially want to use a disaster as a means to recreate the world, redesign all human social institutions so that humanity works in a way that they like it, and humanity works in a way that they think will be better. Well, they will be better able to control and also better able will basically control the consumption of fossil fuels, which I think is I think that's what was Klaus Schwab's impetus for this concept of the Great Reset. So the idea is first worlders consume too many resources. So we need to basically destroy first world society and build it back up from the bottom. And this is the concept of the Great Reset. Now, again, World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, the Davos set, all of these NGOs, totally on paper, they exist, they talk about it. You can go to the dusty record books of all of these these conventions in Geneva that they call, and you can read through them talking about this stuff. It's verifiable. But if you mention any of this, you'll get called a conspiracy theorist. And why? Why? Well, one possibility is that it's in the globalists and the left's general interest to call anybody who opposes them conspiracy theorists. It's an easy way to discredit them, right? And we all know that this is a conspiracy theory thinking. It's a genuine mistake in thinking, and the reason it's a mistake because it generates too many false positives, right? You can always invent a conspiracy theory to explain things away, and therefore, if you grant conspiracies without a lot of evidence of them existing, you'll constantly be calling every single happening a conspiracy of one sort or another. But of course, in typical leftist fashion, they abuse this and they call anyone who points out the apparatus of power on the left a conspiracy theorist. A great example of this is our own friend Faraday Speaks, who just loves doing this. I think he's gone on from conspiracy theorist to cultist, but it's the same insult in different form. Okay, so one of the reasons why this is going to happen, even though we're talking about a very specific organization or a very specific set of organizations with very specific leaders who write about this stuff and talk about it, and you can literally hear their talking points in the words of leaders like Justin Trudeau. The reason why this is called a conspiracy theory also is because the right wing sucks at language. Okay, so if you're going to talk about somebody, some idea or some concept, you have to do a few things. First of all, don't talk about the thing in question like it's already occurred. That sounds like a conspiracy. So if I were to talk about the Great Reset, that sounds like a conspiracy. The Great Replacement sounds like a conspiracy. Because the Great Replacement sounds like the thing that's already occurred when you're talking about something that is an agenda, that maybe it's partially occurred, but it's not over. You're not a historian studying this in the past, and so you shouldn't be using hyperbolic language or language of great finality to discuss something that's happening, that's underway, right? So don't use hyperbolic language. Talk about it casually and be explicit as possible. So don't talk about the Great Replacement. Talk about replacement level migration rates or engineered replacement migration rates. Is that any different than the Great Replacement? No, but it doesn't sound like a conspiracy because it's just a mechanistic description of what's going on. There's a replacement level migration rate, which is, replacement level is just, it's neutral. It's a statistical reality, right? It is replacing populations in geographic areas and soon in large geographic areas. in the sense that surplus birth rates that are not being made by the native population are going to be made up by the children of immigrants. Similarly, for the Great Reset, don't call it the Great Reset. It hasn't happened yet. Call it the Davos agenda, or call it the World Economic Forum agenda, or call it the Klaus Schwab agenda, or the Schwab agenda, or the Schwab plan, right? Call it like it's a proposal. Call it like it's a proposal that's been put before Congress, even if it hasn't been put before Congress. I know this has been discussed in smoky Geneva conference rooms, if people still smoked, which they don't. But I know this is discussed in terms of remote Geneva conference rooms. But for a moment, pretend like this was being proposed as bill and talk about it that way. The Klaus proposal. What do you think about the Klaus Schwab proposal? What do you think about the Davos proposal? Then bring it up casually in conversation to other people. And at all times, remember, act like people need to have an opinion about this, because this is something that's been proposed by our leaders. And just praise it. Say, like, a number of our leaders think that we need to totally destroy society so we can reset it. And this is what, people have been talking about in the Schwab proposal, right? And a lot of people think this is a great idea. And just talk about it like the people you're explaining it to are expected to have an opinion on it. And then once they sort of react negatively to this, then you can go on to, oh yes, this is really happening, and here it is. So I would really recommend people reform the way they use language on the right, so that we don't constantly fall into the left's own stereotype of how we behave. Because we're doing that every time we use language that's hyperbolic, every time we use language that is overly dramatic, and every time we use language that's not exact or practical. We're inviting them to call us conspiracy theorists. And this is not a conspiracy. So not a piano key for $5. Any advice for a disillusioned American Catholic who hasn't been to Mass since the COVID outbreak? So disillusioned with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Well, to be quite honest, my religious practice has been very irregular since the COVID outbreak myself. And it's very difficult. I've been to church. I go to church, but I've missed a lot. I'll say that. And so I'm sort of in the same position you are. I'm disappointed with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. I don't think that's a reason to be disillusioned with the church at all. And furthermore, I would say that right now, I think we have to remind ourselves that right now we're just trying to figure out what's going on. We're trying to figure out what world we live in, who's in control, and what the agenda is. And after we figure out what's going on, which I think will be solidified in the next several months, the next question will be, how do we start building something that can actually hold our leaders' feet to the fire in a way that we haven't been able to hold our leaders' feet to the fire in the past, because it's not working. I think if your crisis coincides with a COVID outbreak, I think really what you're dealing with is not necessarily uncertainty about the church, but uncertainty about the world we live in. I think that's really what everyone's trying to overcome right now, is they're just trying to figure out what's next, what's going to happen with the world we live in. Nothing seems to make sense anymore. And that's something that I'm dealing with right now too. I'm trying to think of a good answer to this question. I really am. I mean, you can't... What you're asking me is, so you're disappointed with an institution. I mean, we all are at this stage, aren't we? And our main question is, how... Our main question is... Excuse me. Pardon me. How do we react to it? And the difficulty is, we don't even know the ground under our feet. we're so out of position that we don't even know the political reality we live under. The only thing I can tell you right now is that I'm very certain that by the time Biden gets sworn, or in the more likely possibility that Biden gets sworn in, or the hopeful possibility that he doesn't, we will know more about the situation we labor under. One of the videos I really wanted to do was things we've learned from COVID-19 in this election, because I think we've learned a lot about how the world works, and we need to proceed accordingly. There's, and this has been one of my major failings in the last year, is just my total inability to build community during the lockdown. We need to start with contact with other people and build from there. And I think if we do that, our faith will return in the institutions that once we felt gave us meaning in life. That being said, if we are indeed in the middle of a true spiritual crisis, in the worst possible world, we always have to fall back on our faith in God and in the eternal existence of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And maybe we're all going to be isolated in these long struggles. But I don't think that these good things can be suppressed forever. I really don't think that they can. And I think that our elites have miscalculated if they think that they're just going to take over the world with artificial intelligence and declare themselves gods among us. I don't think that's. I think they've miscalculated their ability to run the economy in that way, and they've miscalculated their ability to manage the future in that way. So that's the best I can give you right now, but that's a very good question. Nerve AMV Maker, what's important about the activism is getting people to realize that they have no rights under the system, and that the system is at war with them. The brazenness of this fraud has potential to massively red pill people. And this, thank you for the contribution, AMV Maker. That's a very generous super chat as always, and I really appreciate it. Yeah, I think that this election will red pill a lot of people. We just need to make sure that this red pilling gets put into a constructive direction and not wasted on paranoia. My rule of thumb always holds is always be building. Always be building. And if you're always building something for the future, I really think there are a few ways you can go wrong. I say this having 2020 being one of the most failed years of my life, and I don't think I'm alone in this. It's one of the most failed years of my life because I really wanted to use this year to build community, and I really have absolutely nothing to show for it. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, that all that means is I had to change my strategy and make sure that next year's attempt to build community is abreast of that. Is not going to make the same mistakes that I made in 2020. And I think, and part of that is going to be finding some way to use Discord or finding a replacement to Discord in very, very short order. I have been way too busy to help out on the software projects that have been going on in Academic Agents community and in other online right-wing communities. But I know that there are Discord alternatives brewing, and we'll try to do what we can in real life. And I think this will become clear when Biden is president. So Sam153 for USD $20. If worse comes to worse, is it possible for Trump not to officially concede even though they install Biden? Is it possible for Trump not to officially concede even though they install Biden? Could Trump still be a shadow president? Well, I mean, Trump can officially not concede. But the second Trump calls himself president and starts issuing orders to, I mean, what is the president, if he's not in the Oval Office and the military does not recognize him, if the Trump team is dialing up apparatuses like the CIA and the FBI and telling them to disregard presidential orders because he's actual president, they'll just arrest him for treason. And if the military is in Biden's camp, they'll just throw him in prison. I mean, being a shadow president pretty much presupposes that you have some institution that's listening to you and that recognizes you as president and not the person that the military just put in. So there's that, and it also being a shadow president also presupposes that you have some military apparatus that will be able to resist in some capacity the other guy's attempts to just throw you in prison and say, nope, look, he's not president, he's in jail. Because if you're not in the Oval Office and the Secret Service does not recognize you as president and the military does not recognize you as president and you don't have a line of connection to the CIA or the IRS or in the other alphabet soup organizations, then you can be a shadow president as much as possible. You're not president. And if you try doing that, there are many laws in the book that give the federal government broad sweeping powers to remove pretenders and essentially jail them. Because being a pretender without being able to back it up is never legal. Even if there's no official law in the book, they won't tolerate it. Sam for 153 for Canadian $20. What do you think is going to happen in the Georgia Senate elections? Are shenanigans at hand? Are shenanigans at hand that will give it to the Dems, or will the GOP hold out? Well, this is really a hard question for me to answer, Sam, because I have no idea. Have I ever been to Georgia in my entire life? Oh, no, yeah, I was in Savannah once for a job interview. Yeah, Savannah was very nice. But that being said, I have no idea what the bureaucracy in Georgia looks like. I assume that most elections have shenanigans going on in them, so that they could swing a few points here or there in the favor of the powerful. So I'd be surprised if there wasn't. What's really going on in these contested elections is an institutional tug of war, not some kind of contest between people trying to pull off shenanigans and people not trying to pull off shenanigans. It's basically just a yelling contest between elites. And as such, I'm not so sure I know I can answer the question from where I am in the west coast of California. What the political dynamics are of the race in Georgia. I assume that I'm assuming for now that it's entirely separate from the question over who is president, and that if the GOP wins in Georgia, the cathedral and the establishment will chalk it up to fair losses in war, and kind of move on, take their lumps where they get them and move on. So I think it's very possible that the GOP will maintain the Senate, but I don't know. The question really is not whether the GOP maintains the Senate. The question is, what is the GOP? And this is the same reason why I had a hard time answering the previous, I don't want to say caller, the previous super chat message over whether they should join the Young Republicans. I don't know what being a Republican even means in the present era. I don't know what it means. So I can't tell you whether to join them. I can say that it'll be interesting to be a young Republican. It'll be interesting. You'll at least get a few laughs. And I think that the investment's very, very low. And hey, maybe it will turn into something that's meaningful. But I think the bigger question is not whether the GOP will maintain the Senate, but rather whether what it will mean to be GOP. Because, again, in order to function, the cathedral and the established arm of the cathedral, the Democratic Party, they need to have another party. And the name of that party is almost certainly going to be the Republican Party. If they don't have another party, they're doomed. And so the Republican Party is going to have to exist, and it's going to have to, at some point, own one of the bodies of power, most likely the Senate. So I think that's going to have to happen at some point. The bigger question is whether the GOP is actually an opposition party worth noticing. Okay, where was I? Okay, this mouse is terrible. Okay, so Virile Journey says, for $5, says, do you think that the COVID policies are a stepping stone for the internationalist agenda of social isolation, or just a ploy to get Trump out of office? I mean, the thing you have to realize with these things is, I don't think that these people manufacture things. I don't think COVID is... I think COVID, in some sense, is exaggerated in the media, but they didn't manufacture the disease. It's a real disease. It's really killing people. Then that's a real problem that needs to be dealt with. But what you need to keep in mind more than anything else when talking about the cathedral is the word opportunism. These people are opportunists. What they do is they look at the events that are actually happening, and then they decide which ones to focus on and make into bigger stories based on what they think will give them the most leeway to accomplishing their agenda. And I think COVID was a particularly fortuitous circumstances. They saw from the 2016 election that mail-in ballots were more heavily Democrat than Republican. And because of that, they understood that real or not, if a bunch of ballots were mailed in to a polling station and those things were overwhelmingly Democratic, this wouldn't really pull up any statistical red flags, which, based on what we know now about how polling is actually done, statistical red flags are really the only way you can keep people honest about any of these things. So I think that they saw COVID as sort of a twofer. They said, oh wow, this is a really great way to get rid of Trump. If this story becomes a big story, Trump is more likely to be gone, and also we'll have this opportunity to experiment with all of these new policies that all of these really, really smart people in Davos have been telling us about. They've been telling us for a long time we need to fundamentally redesign the economy. They've been telling us for a long time that the consumption habits of Americans is way out of control. Oh, hey, two birds with one stone. Twofer. Awesome. And all it requires is for us to treat a crisis as maybe a little bit more of a crisis than we would have otherwise. It's really more of a finger on the scales than it is an iron hand of manipulation. And so as such, I just think that there were a lot of people who have internationalist sympathies. They saw a business opportunity or a power opportunity, and they just took it. The power was there for the taking, and they took it. Sean for $5. Hey man, I really appreciate your content. I hope this helps you and your family. I can only imagine how difficult it is to balance. Keep it up. Well, yeah, thank you very much. I'm so glad that I'm finished with... Well, I'm not even finished with this family video. Again, the family video is about my father and my grandparents and their relatives' experiences in Eastern Europe as Germans in World War II. So there's going to be a lot of cuts of this interview, and there's a lot of information that my family has decided not only not to publish at the internet, like I might publish on this channel, but to kind of keep under wraps permanently for everyone who's not, my children and my relatives. Not so much because, I'm ashamed of it, but more because, we don't know if some of these people might still be alive or their children might still be alive. And if names come up and all this stuff, when it comes to things that happened between 1937 and 1946 in Eastern Europe, you need to be really careful about this, because there are a number of parties that will punish not only the people who were involved in these things, but their children, and maybe even their children's children. There are a lot of very, very vindictive people who were on the winning side of that war. And if you, I don't know. If you don't believe that, you haven't been paying attention to the world we live in right now. But thank you very much for that contribution. And I do look forward after, well, probably during the holidays to do some original video making as I can find time for it. And guys, it being 12 o'clock right now, I'd ask if we could stop the super chats. I'm very appreciative of all the questions, and I hope that I'm giving correct answers. But my voice, even with my glass of water, it's going to give out after a little bit. It didn't help that I was talking with family all today. So it's not as strong as it would be if I were coming from an 8-hour workday doing computer programming. The Hungry Merchant for $10. Have you seen anything by Meme Analysis yet on YouTube? Oh, okay. So Meme Analysis is a YouTube channel. Surprisingly high quality analysis on modern culture. I have a feeling you two could have a rather interesting conversation. Well, hey, I'll check it out. Right now, I'm having a very difficult time organizing all of these commitments and new channels. Thank you for the super chat. I'll definitely check it out. But in the interest of time, I'm going to reserve my voice for a question. But thank you for the suggestion. The right flag for USA, $50. Well, thank you very much for that contribution. Very, very generous. Thank you for your commentary, Dave. I think evidence of fraud is much weaker than you do. But doesn't that... Thank you for your commentary, Dave. I think evidence of fraud is much weaker than you do. But don't expand on it more. Just wanted for this opinion to be noted. One good thing that should come out of this is for Street Fighting Man to become Charlemagne's theme music. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. It should be played every time he appears in one of the many YouTube streams. Well, Charlemagne's a good guy, and I know he knows that this is an institutional tug of war. He's trying to make it difficult for the cathedral to make a power grab. Now, okay, I'm going to reiterate here, and I know the right flag didn't want me to belabor the point, right? I don't necessarily believe that more fraud existed in this election than existed in any other election. I need to make that clear. I think there's always a certain percentage of fraud and miscounting and undercounting and overcounting and thumbs on the scales in every election. I just think that rarely tips the balances. And so, I'm not saying that I have proof of overwhelming fraud. I think we have evidence of acute cases of fraud, and we have evidences of the fact that a lot of ballots don't seem to have chains of custody, which, for an election to be fair, it seems like they would have to have some kind of chain of custody. But maybe, I'm not some expert on this, so I will defer to the fact that this is an open question. I also think that it is an irrelevant question. I don't care whether you're on the 49% or the 51%. I don't even know what we're trying to measure in this election because the rules are changing and the demographics are changing, and it's just a matter of whoever can get the most heads counted. It seems ridiculous because it's not even really a popular mandate. It's more of a bean counting mandate at the end of the day. Anyway, thank you again for the contribution. I really ask, though, for people like Charlemagne who are taking a more active role in this than I am, give them a break. Their concerns are legitimate, and I think that their actions are going to have consequences that are either going to be good or that are going to be necessary and bad. They're either doing things that are moving the ball forward, or they're making mistakes that we'll need to make and then learn from in the future, if that makes any sense. And so because of that, I will never countersignal people like Charlemagne who want to be activists on this cause. But it's just something, I can't feel passionate about it. I can't feel passionate about it. It's just not in it's not in my emotional capacity to care about these bean counting things. Ron Wood for $20. I suppose when I asked about uni-epistemology, I just meant epistemology in general. Gentile problems, internalists, externalists, etc., etc., etc. It seems like it's really focused on nothing but meta-language and not useful. Well, is this the kind of, when I was in college, I was part of this debate club my first year where people were talking about, pure realism versus pure idealism. And there was this concept that the only honest available answers were to be a 100% materialist who believed that the scientific method was the only thing we could ever believe in. And then there were other people who just believed the exact opposite, and they believed that reality was 100% constructed. And they were complete epistemological skeptics. Yeah, and I think, I'm very convinced that materialism is false. I would be shocked if proof were put in front of me that materialism is true. I would be flabbergasted. I am very certain that that's true. I would be more surprised. I would be less surprised if you showed me something like a magnetic monopole or a perpetual motion machine than I would be some kind of proof that materialism is true. Idealism, I think that's more plausible, that we're all in some kind of reality that in some sense is, Plato's cave or Socrates' cave or Plato's cave, where we're all just completely detached from what's really going on. But I think, we're faced in our own actions, we're faced with so many practical imperatives in our own life that when you're talking about esoteric notions that human existence could be supremely detached from some ultimate reality, I can never get emotionally invested in that, and I can't take it seriously because I can't get emotionally invested in that. I mean, it sounds stupid. I think Plato's cave is very interesting as a religious point of view, and I'm sure that if you're looking at the universe from God's point of view, with no delusions, it looks very, very different than what we're experiencing right now. But the imperatives we have to pursue the good and the true and the beautiful, that are in some sense pre-political, and in another important sense almost pre-epistemological, if you think about it, those questions, you can't walk away from them. Even if, I don't care how skeptical you are, you can't walk away from hitting your head into a brick wall. And this is going to sound really stupid. This is going to sound really, really stupid. But the thing that kind of, I always think about this, when I think about this question, I don't think about philosophy or a philosopher that answered it. I think of Conan the Barbarian, Robert E. Howard's original Conan the Barbarian cartoon. In Conan the Barbarian, I think this is a little bit in the movies too. But he actually is quite learned. He's not quite learned. He has like an animal cunning, but he has this ability to retain philosophical questions that come up, that are brought to him. And in one of Howard's best Conan stories, the Queen of the Black Coast, his sort of consort for that story is this educated pirate. And she brings to him questions about whether the ultimate reality is in the soul and not in battle. And if the whole universe is just a dream. And Conan the Barbarian says, well, if the universe is a dream, then I am just as much a dream inside of it. And as the universe stands right now, there is the imperative of battle and of love and of all these things that are just incident on our minds as we move through this reality. Maybe we are acting in some way that's completely ridiculous. But how is that going to overpower the imperative to defend your family? How is that going to overpower your loyalty to a great spiritual reality or an idea of beauty that you've experienced in the flesh? It can't at some level. And to ignore it in favor of some esoteric rejection of reality in waiting of some kind of more meticulous rational proof is to, in some sense, become the dream that you suspect you are in the worst case scenario. And I am not so sure. It doesn't seem to be a right way to live life. So again, thank you for that super chat donation. I hope I'm coming to the end of these. Don't Tread on Shuck says, who is your patron saint? Do you attend Latin Mass? Thoughts on the growth of Catholics who prefer the pre-1960s liturgy? Well, so I think by patron saint you mean my confirmation saint, because patron saint would mean that the saint can be prayed to as an intercessor to influence that thing. My confirmation saint is actually Saint Paul, and this is not a very sexy story, or interesting story, but for a while I was at a Catholic school, and during that time, this is in high school, I went through confirmation, and I went through confirmation kind of because I had started down in my youth. I'm talking about when I was like 10 or something. I had kind of I was in a Catholic environment, and I was like, oh yeah, this is me. And so I went through this confirmation process basically as an atheist, and I picked Saint Paul because I thought he sounded like he was one of the more academic saints, and because I liked the name Paul more than the name Saint Thomas, right? Who's the other like academic saint. So I picked that really for bad reasons, or really ill-considered reasons. I picked Paul as my confirmation saint. So that's the technical answer of the question, but it's not very interesting. Right after confirmation, I began my atheist phase, which didn't end until my mid to late 20s, mid 20s, not more mid 20s, but So it wasn't well considered. We attend Novus Ordo. I like Latin prayers, but it's we don't really attend Latin Mass. We have friends that are big Latin Mass people, and they always in the before times. I remember them trying to kind of recruit us to the more Latin side of things. One time when I talked to them, and then I knew people in Seattle who were into that scene as well. But it really, I always like to say that I'm more in fan of the base Novus Ordo, where you have vernacular and Latin mixed in, and so the forms of Vatican II are bolstered or are buttressed by the forms of sort of the Trentian version of Mass, and I think that's sort of the future. And to kind of to apocryphally quote Hegel, we could say that this really is the thesis of Vatican II meeting the antithesis of the Society of Saint Pius X or the Fraternal Society of Saint Peter. And then the natural synthesis that we need to go forward is obviously, in my opinion, a combination of Latin and vernacular, such that the form of the Mass will be a universal language, but that it is still discernible to those who practice it at a very, very low IQ level. I don't like saying low IQ level, but you know what I mean, at a very low education level. Okay, I would assume that what's going to happen, again, these thoughts on the growth of Catholics who prefer the pre-1960s liturgy, I presume what's going to happen is that the Latin Mass Catholics are going to grow and grow and grow, and that the Orthodox Novus Ordo, the only way they're going to grow is by being more liturgically conservative. And I think eventually what's going to happen is that the Latin Mass Catholics and the liturgically sound Novus Ordo are going to look across the aisle and go, look, we really have more in common with each other than anyone else on the outside. Let's find some kind of chocolate and peanut butter combination and make this thing work. Mind's Eye for $5. Will Grendel feature in your Shrek video as an example of anti-Shrek? It poses a reversal of the fairy tale monster, yet is a covert satire. Are you talking about Gardner's Grendel? I love that book, by the way. Oh shit! I've already recorded that version. Well, I mean, now you're making me. Now this is terrible because I kind of made the exact point. Of maybe I'll include a picture of that book. Now I'm really regretting that I didn't mention that. The part where I would have mentioned I think the author is the author Martin Gardner, the person who did. So by the way, everyone knows Beowulf, and his monster was Grendel, who was this ogre, right? So in the early 20th century, I think in the 40s, an author, I think by the name of Gardner, he wrote a book that was like Beowulf, but from the ogre's perspective. And it's really good, and it has all these sort of cute philosophical games, and I really enjoyed reading it, and now I'm kicking myself for not mentioning it, because it would have very much buttressed the point that I was going to make in the Shrek video. But unfortunately, I already recorded that portion of the video. Maybe I'll find some way of making Grendel appear in the second half. If not, I'll just put a picture in one of the slides. But thank you for reminding me of that book. Great book. Simon Laplace for NT75. Did you see the stream of Michael Malice and Molebug where Molebug said he was open to talk to you if you contacted him? Yeah. And then I did send him an email, and I haven't yet heard back. But it sounds like he's really, really busy. And given how busy I am during the holiday season, I can only imagine how busy he is. The guy hasn't updated his Substack for quite a while. And, he's got a job and kids just like me. So I don't doubt that he's looking at the same hectic holiday seasons I am. And I'd expect that he might get back in contact with me in January if he's interested. One caveat, though, and one thing I suspect that he might be a little bit hesitant to come on my channel because of the fact that I did a video on his work. Now, he's been very reticent to talk to Nick Land because Nick Land based a lot of his work on Mencius Moldbug. And so he said in that same interview that he's always very hesitant to talk to people who comment on him because, and I agree, it's kind of awkward, right? Because now he's in the position of just saying, "Oh, hey, you're full of shit. You completely got me wrong," And moreover, if I say anything, he's kind of getting his own ideas pre-processed and returned back to him. So it kind of takes on this, human centipede kind of thing where the input goes in the output, and you experience the Ouroboros, and I can tell that kind of makes Mencius Moldbug uncomfortable. And since he's uncomfortable talking to Nick Land, he might also be uncomfortable talking to me because, admittedly, his stuff is a very big influence on me. So, if it happens, that would be great. If it doesn't, it won't. I contacted him a while back. But again, given how hectic the holiday seasons are, I'm not expecting a prompt response, nor will I take it personally if he doesn't want to come on. So, I saw part of that interview. My wife really does not like Michael Malice. I think she thinks he's kind of creepy. I don't know why I threw that out there, but I kind of like him. He's kind of a weirdo, though, isn't he? We're all weirdos, I guess. Talios Hammerfist for $10. Is the friend-enemy dichotomy the only framework useful in politics? No, not at all. I mean, it's just the most fundamental one, right? I mean, it's like saying... it's like saying, okay, so let me explain chess to you, right? So the purpose of chess is you have and this is how all languages work, and this, I think this is the best answer I can give. So what's the purpose of chess? Once you learn how all the pieces move, what's the objective of the game? Well, the objective of the game is to take the king, right? That's it. All you have to do is take the king. There's an additional rule that says that you have to announce before you take the king, right? But other than that, the only goal is to take the king. Okay, but very few people who play chess think that way. They don't think like, oh, I'm going to take the king and I'm going to move here, 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 and here, and they've got this plan to take the king all lined up, right? What chess players do is they kind of come up with secondary objectives. Like, what I'm doing is developing my rooks. What I'm doing is developing my queen. What I'm getting is board control. What I'm doing is advancing my pawns, right? The same thing is true for Magic the Gathering, for instance. Like, what's the goal of Magic the Gathering, right? The goal of Magic the Gathering is to get your opponent to 0 life or to deck him, right? And it's presumably everything you do in Magic the Gathering is to move that objective forward, right? So the fundamental thing in chess is to take the king. The fundamental thing in Magic the Gathering is to get him to 0 life, right? But that's not how good players play. In chess, you want to get board control and you want to develop your powerful pieces. You want to whittle down the points total of his side. You want to make good trades. And usually when you're playing the game, what you have is you have artificial constructions built on top of the ultimate objective of taking the queen that help you as a human of limited mental capacity conceptualize the larger game in smaller pieces. And the same thing is true for Magic the Gathering for those players out there. Good players, they either optimize tempo or card advantage, right? Those are the two big things you try to do. Now, tempo or card advantage are not the object in Magic the Gathering, right? They're just mental constructions that we've built on top of the game's meta, so that we as limited beings don't have to see things as a sequence of 100 events. We can see things as a series, as a much more finite series, a much smaller set of events that track us up and down these artificial metrics. But board position and developing your pieces and castling and doing these good openings and whittling your opponent's pieces down are not the objective of chess. The objective of chess is to take the person's king. And anybody who thinks that board position, I mean, you know, in everything, all good political concepts are ways of productively organizing friend-enemy distinctions, so that we can minimize the fallout to our own goals, right? And we build constructions, artificial constructions on top of that, like a meta. Now, what's happened in politics is sort of the classic autistic mistake, right? We've mistaken the meta tool for the game itself. It's like the professional chess player who's getting this great position, and then he ignores his king, and then, you know, the 5-year-old moves his bishop into position and checkmates him, right? Because he was so preoccupied with all these complicated abstractions. You know, I don't know how often that happens in chess, but I think it quite frequently happens in politics, where we lose sight of what's actually going on. What's actually going on in politics is a negotiation of power over people who have differing and possibly conflicting loyalties. The ultimate dream of politics is to find a way of playing these games in a way so that everyone can get as much as possible towards their larger loyalistic goals. And I think given that we're all human, and given that we all experience the universe in some consistent ways, this ultimate dream of politics isn't a failed one, right? We could construct some apparatus that would allow us to achieve world peace. And I think there is a reactionary plan for world peace. But fundamentally, when you take this machine apart and you see how all the pieces work, you know, behind all the smoke and mirrors, what's going to be going on is friend-enemy distinctions all the way down. But that's the physics of the thing. That's what the abstractions are standing in place of. Great. So Stephen Brocky for $10 $100 Hong Kong. I don't know how much money that is, but who knows? He says, late to the stream, may have been asked already, but thoughts on creating awareness for normies of how the cathedral is acting against us, especially families. Well, this hasn't been asked on this stream, but I mean, it's getting more. The thing is that the problem with Mencius Moldbug is everything that was brilliantly observed in 2008 is just getting so obvious these days. It's getting so obvious, and so I think, and this is, I guess, I'll answer the question this way. When you're talking to normies, you have to answer in the most practical way and in the most immediate way. You have to go to the thing that is most immediately to hand. You can't go around with abstractions. Therefore, the language of the normie is always current events and always things that are existing in their immediate proximity. And because of that, tools to red pill people in the past have been very, very rare. But I feel increasingly the way to red pill people about how power is actually executed, aka not through the apparatuses you learn about in high school civics class. You just need to point to what's going on in the news. Point to the most recent media abuse, and then show them how all of these disparate actors that should be in competition with each other all seem to mysteriously come up, not only with the same narrative, but in many cases the literal same words. We've known this since the journalist scandal, but we know everyone. All these people who work in the journalism industry, they all talk to each other online, and they all figure out what they're publishing. And through that process of talking shop with each other, they naturally come up with a consensus of what the narrative is. Because, it's expensive to break with the narrative. Because if you break with the political narrative, that means you're going to have more scrutiny applied to you. And, if that's how your career can really take damage, right? If you get a fact wrong and you're going with the narrative, well, no harm, no foul, right? No harm, no foul. But if you go against the preferred narrative and you get a fact wrong, that could end your career. It could end your career in a big way. I'm trying to think of a good example of that, but it's not coming to mind right now. Okay, so the right cafe for $2. Do you respect Big Chungus? Okay, just so for the non-meme literate people in the chat, Big Chungus was a meme from 5 years ago. In Bugs Bunny, there's a scene, like a throwaway scene, where he gets inflated and looks incredibly obese. He turns into this fat rabbit that's grinning. And in the for some reason, because this is very 2014, people loved putting Big Chungus, which was the name of this fat rabbit, in various contexts that were dissonant and apropos, and I think Big Chungus is funny. I don't know if he really deserves my respect, but I'll try that. Okay, so I think we're winding down here since we're coming to the 3-hour mark, I think. And I think I needed to go longer this time because it's been so long. But I really appreciate everyone for being patient with me. And I'll try to get a video out sometime this holiday season. And it looks like I have some live streams scheduled. Oh, by the way, I should mention, me and Settlers Lament are doing a live stream at 2 p.m. tomorrow. And we're going to be, I think we're just going to be shooting the breeze about like the grill pill and stuff like that. Hopefully it'll be a really laid back talk on his channel. I think Charlemagne's going to be there too. Yeah, but I'll say this about Charlemagne. Charlemagne is the one video maker that he's really good at inspiring jealousy in me. Like, a lot of video makers like Academic Agent are more successful than me on the right. Obviously, I make criticisms of Vouch and ContraPoints, and so their guys come into the the chat, and they always accuse me of being jealous of Natalie Wynn and Vosh and ThoughtSlime because they're so much more successful at YouTube. And it's always funny because I always say, I always say to them, I'm married to a woman I love. I have a child and a family and my faith. I wouldn't choose to be in Natalie Wynn's shoes for all of the super chats in the entire world. Are you kidding me? and as for Vosh, I think the product that Vosh is selling is rapidly nearing its expiration date. Vosh will get killed, I believe, by maybe Vosh will survive. I should say this, but people like Vosh. His type of stick is going to get really unpalatable right around summer if Joe Biden is elected. Right around the point where it's obvious that, okay, now the Democrats are in charge. You no longer have Trump to react to. Because at that point, there's going to be a leftist civil war, and all of these copycats like Dima Mama and Xander Hall are just going to get BTFO'd by that conflict. Because they're either going to have to hard denounce and cancel people to their far left, or they're going to have to basically cancel everyone who's at all connected to reality on their right. I think that's going to destroy their product. And so, I wouldn't, even though I consider Vosh's personal life to be entirely depressing, I wouldn't even want his content. But, on the right, with Academic Agent, there's a possibility of jealousy. He's more successful than me. And, although he's been forced into a situation by unethical actors that has forced him to live off of his channel and his online work. But I've kind of, every now and again, I've been tempted into jealousy because he's more successful than me. But with Charlemagne, I will say this about him, is that he's really good at making videos where I'm just like, why didn't I make that video? Like, why didn't I make this exact video? The one he did on Trump before the election was marvelous. The one he did several months ago on the future of the right wing was amazing. And the Franklin, who's another YouTuber who I admire, who oftentimes asks the right question, for some reason, the way he does his videos never really... I would never make a video like he does, so I'm not jealous of it. But Charlemagne's really good at making content where I'm just like, why couldn't I have done that before he did? So I will say that about Charlemagne. Everyone check out his channel. So thank you very much, Dreadnought, for the beer. And I think this is going to be the last super chat of the night. Paul Cornelius for $5. Hi, Dave. Which YouTubers you inspired are you the most impressed by? Well, that's a hard one. I don't know who I actually inspired. I kind of get the idea that I might have inspired Settler's Lament, but I can't say that I did. Obviously it's no. And I'll answer the question I wished you'd ask, which YouTubers inspired me. Which YouTubers inspired? So my path as a YouTuber was that I was sort of I was a conservative Catholic blogger who hated the Republican Party. And then Trump happened, and I came in contact with the alt-right, which was a thing back then before it imploded. And I was like, there are ideas here that like I didn't like I am still sort of a racialist skeptic. Race is important in certain temporal senses, but ultimately it's not what you should build your society around, period. And so, I was doing some live streams with people like Argent Templar, which I wasn't taking seriously at all. And it was just like a lark for me. And then what really kind of inspired me to do thoughtful content was the Franklin, who didn't call himself the Franklin back then. You can find his old name. I won't say it because maybe he's trying to get away from that name. But he used to blog under a different name, or vlog under a different name. And it's hard to say what... Well, I know the video, because he had a number... He had a variety of videos on his old channel. Basically, it fell into three categories. The first was observations about living in Asia as an Anglo, which was really good content, very insightful and very honest. And he and Millennial Woes had the stuff I liked. I liked Millennial Woes' videos about depression and introspection and looking back in history and seeing something greater. And I felt, and then he had sort of the alt-right content, both Millennial Woes and the Franklin, which was more racial, which I didn't like very much. And I find it entertaining. It was sort of a guilty pleasure of mine in that regard, but it was something that I disagreed with on certain points. And then, in addition to his edgier content, he had sort of like the core neo-reaction content. And when I saw this core neo-reaction content, I was just blown away by it. Now, what was so funny about this was that I had read Mencius Moldbug almost a year before. And I don't know if I had just read the wrong stuff by him, or if I hadn't been forwarded the wrong if I had been forwarded the wrong articles. I think I read the whole patchwork thing, right? But I had taken from Mencius Moldbug that he was sort of a crackpot who was doing experimental monarchism. Somehow, the whole sort of reactionary theory of power that he was calling back to, I had kind of not... It seemed to have fallen to the background for some reason. And now I was hearing those ideas coming from the Franklin, who was combining them with his own personal insights. And I was like, wow, I mean, like this is explaining a lot of the failures that I'm seeing in my more moderate Catholic community. Now, I'll say this. Neo-reaction has a huge hole in it that has to do with that super political teleological motivation that necessarily has to pre-exist before our engagement with politics. There's no way to do politics without some kind of motivating aesthetic end goal. And neo-reaction leaves that blank. And for that reason, in some sense, neo-reaction is a brain in search of a soul. It needs something like Christianity. So it did not, by any means, displace my Catholicism, but that interaction, paired with the failures of the church that I was observing, not so much in my own community, but more macrocosmically, convinced me that not only was politics necessary, but that a totally different view of politics was necessary to develop. As for the YouTubers, I mean, obviously I'm a big fan of Settler's Lament. I'm going to assume he was inspired by me. I'm going to toot my own horn. I think his videos are really good. They're a little too short for my taste, but he does the right thing. He makes 10-minute videos, which I am incapable of making because I'm a blabbermouth and I've never had a concise thought in my entire existence, which is one reason why, I probably got a PhD. Because if you're going to write a PhD thesis, you better not have a concise thought in your mind. Hey, Justine Brown is in the chat. I got into her book and I'm still making my way through it. I always wanted to take a vacation to Southern California and read her book. I fully intend to do that. My wife really wants to go to Disneyland and explore Hollywood. And I always thought it would be good if we used her book as a guide. What was her book called? Hollywood Eden? It's something like that. It's the opposite of Hollywood Babylon, right? It's the okay, well, I'm blanking on it, but you should check it out. But I always wanted to. It's always good to go to a place with a book about that place. That's like my favorite way to to go to a place is to go to a book with that. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So if I can presume that the Settler's Lament was inspired by me, that would be a great option. I should mention here that I wish Fritz Imperial would make political content. I think that he convinced himself in 2018 that no one wanted to hear his opinion on politics, and I think he's dead wrong about that. So here's a shout out for the return of Fritz Imperial. If I can presume that R.N. McIntyre was inspired by me, I really like his content. I kind of really like the fact that he's a board gamer too, which probably makes it a little easier for me. When you share your guilty pleasures, the small things in life, right? I know that doesn't mean anything ultimately. Yeah, I know, guys. I appreciate that it's getting late, so I probably should stop done the stream. Closington's a great channel. If I don't mention, Mythesis. I'm just mentioning all of the younger neo-reaction bloggers that came on after me. And Mythesis, who does great deep takes on Molebug. He's a great one. To be quite honest, Settler's Lament makes probably better YouTube videos, but Mythesis. Oh god, I can't pronounce his name. He makes videos that work more at my speed, like slow and laborious. Okay, so I'm gonna stop answering this question before I incriminate myself here. I'll just say that all of the young neo-reactionary bloggers are McIntyre, the guy whose name I can't pronounce. I don't care if you weren't inspired by me. I'm really impressed and inspired. I think your content's amazing, and I hope you guys continue to produce more. I'm going to quickly just go over these questions from the entropy stream, just to encourage more people to use entropy. I'll just answer them very, very quickly so that I can stop, so I can get to bed. So, Chickman, how is distributism better than other third positionist ideologies like fascism and National Socialism? It seems to be a mix of libertarianism, Christianity, and fascism. Well, I mean, it kind of is. I mean, it's a third positionist ideology. This is pretty easy. Distributism is better than fascism because it's more specific and it puts first things first. Family is the first and most fundamental political organization that we owe affiliation to that has, I'm making a caveat here, that has corporal representation on this earth. I guess, you could argue that the church does too, but I feel like we're splitting hairs there. I feel distributism, the thing about fascism is it's open-ended. It's about loyalty, but then it begs the question, to what? And then when you're loyal to this object that's been specified as the fundamental political object, what happens to other loyalties you have, right? What happens to your loyalties to the church? When do those loyalties take priority? Distributism is the most important because it strikes at what for everyone should be a primary loyalty. A family should be a primary loyalty to which only a divine command should be able to overpower. And so I just think that distributism is starting in the right place, where National Socialism is starting in the exact wrong place, and fascism is starting in no place. It's starting in choose your own place. So you have to go back to the dignity of the family, the individual's place in the family, and then the individual's place in history and its obligations to those objects as they move into history. And also distributism, although it's not religious itself, technically, does not make sense, I believe, outside of a religious context. And so I think it is a necessary missing puzzle piece in our approach to politics and economics. And I know when I say this, that in addition to the video that I have half recorded, I have the video that I haven't even started or finished writing, which is the Distributism video, which I've written the first chapter of it. If that's worth anything. Come on, guys, give me a break. I'm struggling with having any time to do videos here. So I appreciate that people give me shit over the Distributism video because I deserve it. Okay, so thank you for getting on my case about that. But that being said, I never intended to promptly deliver on this. But thank you for hounding me nonetheless. To quote G.K. Chesterton himself, it's important that a man be held to his own promises. It's important that if you break your promise, you should be held to account. And even though I'm nowhere near even starting that video, I've written the first chapter 3 times and the second chapter 2 times and torn them up 5 times between all of them. It's still important that you remind me of the obligation because I do have an obligation to at some point deliver on that. Okay, so Sage says, would you invite Moldbug to a podcast? Well, okay, I already did that, right? So the guy goes on to say, why should non-Catholics embrace distributism? Distributism... Protestantism should embrace distributism because distributism is not so much Catholic as it is. I can see distributism being practiced without Catholicism. I even can, in a pinch, see distributism being practiced without Christianity. I can't see distributism being practiced without a concept of God. I don't think an irreligious people would ever be attracted to it to begin with, right? The point of distributism is to come up with a certain set of key observations about what important political values are, right? So it's saying, A, what is your most fundamental loyalty? Well, I already answered that, right? Corporal loyalty to God and family, right? So there immediately we have the beginning of a friend-enemy distinction. Then it makes a certain number of observations about, if everyone has these central loyalties, then what are some political principles we might use to maximally resolve human political interactions so that we can minimize the amount of harm and conflict that comes to everyone's objectives in the sort of Hobbesian sense of the word, right? Okay, fine. You call it, the speaker says it's weak and decentralized, and to a certain extent, it is. You're going to have distributism. Distributism is only part of the puzzle, and that's from my research, it is a set of observations about how an extant political order would be able to procure happiness and fulfillment, and both spiritual and corporal, inside the families that they want to carry forward, and inside the vocations they want to carry forward towards a church or towards a larger spiritual reality. That's the piece of the puzzle that distributism addresses. Distributism does not address the problem of how such a society could prevail against an incredibly hostile and concerted effort to undermine it from external actors. That, I think, would have to be answered by another, more realistic philosophy. And we'd have to return once more to something that's more Schmittian, or something that might be more Moldbugian, or whatever adjective. Machiavellian might be the example, right? But I think, that's really... It's a piece of the puzzle, and it's a piece of the puzzle that if you're Christian or religious, I think you need to understand why the distributists were right about a few things. A few very, very important things that necessarily should be centered before we try to rebuild or take stock of what went wrong with our society and why it's falling apart. So with that being said, I'm going to kind of wind down this stream. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. I know it's corporeal, right? Yeah, so did I say corporeal? Pardon me. Yeah, it's late, guys. It's late. So pardon my mispronunciation of that word. But I guess this is my first Linux stream. Hopefully Mr. AppGet will be able to actually make this thing work half as well as it does on Windows. And I'll have something prettier to look at next time. But in the meantime, thank you for joining me in this return to form for me. Everyone, please, 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 in this time of turmoil, whatever you do in terms of your actions, remember to keep what is most valuable safe. And that is, don't sacrifice your well-being and the well-being of your family for the ambitions of some politician. If they truly are a Caesar of destiny, if this really is a battle that holds in it the fate of your own family, I think the question and that reality needs to be very, very stark. And it needs to be something that's undertaken with a certain amount of weight. More and more when I look back upon this last year, I see everyone losing connections, losing friendships, sometimes even losing contact with the family. And in place of that, they've put political loyalties, which make absolutely no sense when you take a step back and look at them in the grand scheme of things. And to me, that's just a fundamental mistake. Yeah, I think, to me, progressives do this a lot more than do right-wingers. But participate in politics, but always remember that your fundamental loyalty are to those who've put their trust in you and to for whom and who gave you, I should say in turn, who gave you all the things that you now rely on. And that for the most part, those are very, very close friends and family for most people. And it's you should never sacrifice those real loyalties for men of ambition, unless you're absolutely certain that their fates and your fate are bound up with those larger political figures. And I don't think, and this is my opinion, but it is my opinion, I don't think that stark choice has been put before us yet. I think that it might be in the process of bubbling up, but as I see it, that place is not, that time is not now. So please take care of your families. Keep close to your true friends, and I always keep faith in divinity and the things that are beyond. And with that, I'll wish you guys all a good night, and